We are live. Yeah, welcome back. We're going to continue exploring HTML in quite a bit more depth today. Yesterday we focused on it was a lot of repeats of what we kind of touched on late last week. But we focused more on the structure, the how, and the why. Today we're going to dive into some of the things that we explored, like tables and forms. Forms specifically is something that you're going to do for the rest of your career, almost without fail. There's a lot of new cool form elements that are relatively new and modern, and we're going to dive into those in great depth and then learn how to play with them, learn kind of some of the pros and cons, and then just to, continue to practice and explore with the things that we've been learning over the past week and a half. Just a quick refresher from yesterday. We learned a few new Visual Studio Code things. We learned that if I'm in an HTML file, for example, one quick shortcut is the exclamation point tab, because it's kind of a framework or a template of a bare bones rudimentary HTML file, so you don't have to type out all the stuff that you're always going to have on every project as a shortcut. We learned about the structure, which is really important, right? So we know that everything that is inside the head is metadata, how you want to pronounce it. This is stuff that is going to be for the browser and for Google, various search engines and spiders, but not stuff that's going to necessarily be displayed inside the main window. And then everything else goes inside the body. We also started yesterday talking a little bit about style from an engineering standpoint, and starting to develop the things that we like to see. Structurally, we learned that having everything together, right, all on one line. If we were making a list 1. Right, and list 2. Right. This is equally valid HTML as giving yourself some white space and some padding so that you can easily work with and manipulate the elements. There is nothing that is different between this version that we have, where we have things broken out on their own lines, as there are smushed together. Okay. We also briefly touched on some of the more esoteric things that you will use occasionally, like the video and the media elements, being able to use embed videos or audio into your websites and products. That might be useful if you're building a help site. You need to be able to display, here is how to use this product. Being able to use those elements, we learned how to embed a YouTube video. Those kind of things you'll do pretty often, but not often enough that it's going to be the main focus of your day-to-day efforts. The stuff we're going to cover today, for sure, will be something you do way more frequently, and that's working with tables, working with forms, and all the different elements, ways to capture user input. Okay. Any questions over any of the stuff we went over yesterday? Was there any parts of our homework that kind of gave you tripped you up, that anyone wants to review before we move on? Yeah, go ahead, Leah.
It's not a question, but I just wanted to point out if you type like lorem 10 or something,
Mm-hmm.
it'll generate 10 words of lorem ipsum.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, like if you type in lorem 10 and then tab, or lorem 50 or whatever, in one word.
Yeah, that is
Yeah.
excellent. I didn't know that. That's new to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, it's really helpful.
Yeah, as we talked about with the lorem ipsum text, this is something that you're going to see pretty frequently, especially when you're working with new templates, or if you're just trying to show off what something will look like without having the user focus on the actual content. This type of thing is very useful. I don't personally, I don't spend a lot of time building new interfaces like this and showing things off to customers, so I don't use this very often in my day-to-day, and so this is a new tool to me as well. Good tip. Does it accept any number of things? 50?
Yeah, whatever number.
Sure enough, that's pretty cool. That's an useful tip. So you can kind of control the size of your paragraphs. Let's press Alt Z so we use word wrap. We can show this off. Let's do lorem 1000. Cool. That's a big block of text. Let's see what this will look like in our webpage. Go live. Pulls it up here. If we minimize our screen a little bit, yeah. I'm on the. I have to save this file, so that we're going to call this page2.html. Right. Save. If I go to page2.html, this is going to be a giant wall of text. Very cool. Neat tip. So that's lorem, and then the number of lorems that you want to put. What do I do here? Fine. All right, so diving back in, yeah, we learned about the structure. We learned about some of the typography elements that you're going to use pretty frequently: strong, bold, EM, I. Do you guys remember the rules? It's not really rules, but just guidelines and suggestions. When should you use strong? When should you use bold? Why would we want to use strong instead of bold?
Because HTML isn't supposed to like cover the appearance of it. It's just supposed to cover like the meaning of it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's semantic document structure versus non-semantic, where it's kind of mixing and matching the metaphors of HTML versus CSS. Yeah, that's exactly right. Good job. All right, diving into tables. So we learned about this briefly last week, but we're going to spend quite a bit more time today going over all the cool things that you can do with tables. The first thing, later, let's make a new file. Delete this silly one we were playing with. New file, and we'll call this tables.html. Right, all about tables. And I'm going to make myself a new HTML document. We'll give this a title, and we'll say table fun. Right, cool. All right, so the default thing we learned. I'm going to make table fun. Right, we're going to make a top level heading 1, so that it says that this entire page is going to be about tables. But let's play with the first table we learned. We learned yesterday about basic tables. So if I come and I say basic table, right, H2, we learned that it has to have a table tag, and it's going to have an ending tag. Does anyone remember what the tag is for a row? How do we make a row in tables?
TR.
TR, yeah, exactly right. So anything that goes in between the TR is going to be on one line. So if you're thinking of it like a spreadsheet, this is going to be row A, or excuse me, spreadsheets are numbered, right? So row 1 is inside this TR. If I come in here and I make another TR, this is going to be row 2, right? Now, how do we make a cell, an individual cell inside the table? Does anyone remember the element for that?
TD.
Yeah, that's right, TD. Let's give ourselves a little bit more room here. So if we go here, we say cell 1, TD, and we can put any number of cells in here that we want. So we can put cell 2, right, and let's just copy and paste a few of these, right, and 3, 4, 5, 6, right. So when we load our page, which is now called tables.html, we can see that it creates a basic table. Now, obviously this table is ugly. We don't have any styles defined in this HTML thing that would let us have a border. One of the attributes of table is we can say border equals 1, right? And now it's going to give us a really ugly looking default border. This is an attribute that can go in the table element. Another way that we could do this is on the individual cell level. So if we take out border equals 1, we can start to learn a little bit about CSS here, in that each of these tables can have let's make a style. Each table cell, we can define it by TD, and we could say border 1px solid black, right? And so now each cell in the table has a border around it. We can also change this and do it on the TR, right? If we wanted to say that the row itself has a, oh, we can't. Yeah, it doesn't have a border element. But we can put a border around the entire table, and we can put a border around both the entire table and the cells. So this is essentially what border equals 1 is doing behind the scenes. You can see that it's giving this little bit of white space in between these table cells, and you can see that it's got, if you can kind of like look closely, you'll see that there's extra space here down at the bottom. That's because we've got another row in here that we haven't done anything with. So if we copy all of these cells in here, we will see now that everything is nicely formatted and structured, right? We've got a little bit of extra white space around it, and if we, do you guys remember how we would inspect? It's if you right click and go to inspect, we can go in here and scroll to the bottom and see that there's a padding of 1 pixel around each cell, and then there's a border of 1 pixel around the entire element, right? So the border is going to always be the outermost thing. Padding is going to be the innermost spacing between the edge of the border and the center of the content. And then if we wanted to add some margin around this, margin would be margin is the space outside of the border. So if we inspect this element again, we can save. Yeah. That's not showing up. That's fine. We'll play with that more later this week. Anyway, but this is a basic table, right? We learned that there's table row, table cell. All right. What else can we do? Andrew, you actually, I think, had this in your example. You were using a more advanced. What is another element that we can use in here besides TRs and TDs?
The TH, the table head.
Yeah, great. So TH is exactly what you would expect. We can make a TH. Excuse me. It still needs to be in a row, right? So we're still going to make a table row here. But if we wanted the top element of our table to be specifically defined as a heading, we would come in here and use the TH tag, and we could say name, right? TH email, and then the following rows, when we actually create this in here, TD, and we say Eric, TD, ERH at the clubhouse, right? What this is going to do stylistically is that it is going to make it bold and make it centered. I think it makes it centered. Let's make this bigger. Let's say we're going to add the width attribute, and we're going to say 200. Let's see if that stretches it out. Yeah. So it centers that table heading. So we make this make it more apparent. Anything that's in a TH is going to be centered and bolded by default. Right? We're going to learn to override all of that with styles later on this week. So that's the other major type. There are a few other interesting things that you might want to use. Right? There's a T head. So when we're talking about semantic structures of documents, right? We might not want to. We might want to tell our browser that the stuff that is going in here is a heading and is data that is like just for structural purposes only. So for that, we have a T head element that belongs directly underneath the table, and it needs to be closed. But what we put inside this T head is rows, right? So it can have a row here. Took out the border. Equals 1. Right? So semantically, we're saying this table has a section that is heading specific, right? Because oftentimes, especially as you're building a product, you might actually have multiple levels of table headings, right? We could do a TR, and we could say TH. Call span equals 2. Long heading. TH. Right? And so now what we've done is we've created we use the call span attribute to span through 2 columns. So rather than each one being the same, we can say that we know we have 2 specific columns here. So the TDs are like defining the column cells. We're going to go through both of them for one specific heading, but we still have all of those grouped inside the table head. Okay. Now, if there's a table head, what do you expect also as an element we can use here?
T-body.
T-body. That's exactly right. These HTML inventors weren't all that clever. They reuse the same concepts over and over again, right? So we can have a T-body in here. And you'll notice that this is doing nothing different to our table. Everything that is in this table looks exactly the same with or without the T-head and with or without the T-body. But what it does is telling, this browser or future browsers, or if we were using, if we wanted to embed this in an XML document, it's telling us more information about the structure of this document, right? Because we know that this is the heading of the table, but there is absolutely nothing stopping us from coming in here and saying, we can even use, the TH element inside of an individual role by itself. So if we wanted to say user ID 1 TH, right? Let's say TH ID. Right? So now we have a table heading, the TH tag, that is row specific instead of column specific. You'll notice that as I added a third column of content here. we have this col span 2 here. That was our second long heading. And you'll notice now it's only going through 2 of those. It did not stretch the full distance and cover all 3. So this is something that you're going to always need to be aware of, especially later on when we get into using code, JavaScript, to loop through and create tables for us. You'll often put things like sort functions in tables so that you can easily click on, you can imagine you click on the name and sort this list of names by the click. But sometimes you'll have long headings. You'll want to make sure that as you're adding more content to your table, if it's increasing the width of your columns, you want to come through and make sure that anything that you've stretched over those columns is going to be you're gonna want to make sure that you keep up to date with that. Go ahead, Gregory.
If you use the percentage sign, will it automatically change the size for you?
Of this for the call span?
Yeah.
I don't think so. Call span is expecting to get a number that is tied to the number of columns. It kind of worked here, but if you notice over here on the far right, it is going to 100%, and it's kind of overlapping. If you look at these borders, it's breaking the table. Let's look that up though. W3 schools. Let's go straight to there and see what the documentation says. So if we come in here and search, we'll say call span. Right? Let's just see. Yeah, TD call span attribute. The call span attribute defines the number of columns a cell should span. You always want to put a number. Specifies the number of columns it should span. Note, if you put a 0, it tells the browser to span the cell to the last column of the call group. So if we put a 0 in here, let's see what happens. I don't know what that means. I've never used a 0. Okay, so it just did one column. Cool. So call span is an attribute you'll use pretty often, especially when you get into developing products. One really common use of a table like this is, this would be like a users table, and we'd want to have stuff like, maybe you'd want to say, these are admins, right? And let's assume we've got a couple different users in here, and then you'd maybe want to have, let's actually put this down here, because we're going to put it in table heading. Then you'd have a second call span that is like regular users, right? And then you'd have a few of these, right? So this is a very common usage pattern of this type of, if you're going to do like a call span that is covering a more complicated table, right? These are all going to have the same format, so your table is always going to have the same columns, but every once in a while you want a divider that says these are special users, these are not so special users. You'll do stuff like this all the time. Another great use of this in real world is for things like categories. So this could be like a list of fruits. This could be like a list of meats. If you're building like a grocery shopping app or something like that, you might display the data in a table because it's tabular content, and you might have things like I need to buy 4 fruits, 4 bananas, and the price is $10, right? And it'll calculate all that. You're going to use tables pretty often when you're talking about quantities of things, lists of things that have math attached to them. So a shopping list or a receipt is a really great example of that, where you'll say, banana, 10, $1 each, and then at the far end you'll have $10, the combined price. You'll do this quite a bit with things like invoicing. You'd even come down here at the bottom, if you can imagine that this was this is the final row. You might say like, let's see, you might leave the first column blank, right? Because you can leave that box empty, and you can come over here and see total price $10, right? So you could have like a calculated list that you've got a whole bunch of numbers inside your table, and then at the very bottom you're going to count all of those up or do some math on them. This is a common pattern you're going to do pretty frequently. Tables are kind of cool. So what else can we do with tables? We learned about something that you could do that was kind of special with lists yesterday. Does anyone remember what was interesting about lists when we were talking about like complicated lists? What was that?
Make a nest.
Yeah, that's right. So we can also nest tables, right? Sometimes you've got a complicated table. Let's just make a simple one real quick that has a tr, and we'll say name, Eric. And then our second cell, instead of just saying, two things individually, where it's like Eric and Harrison, right? Rather than being like this, let's add the border again so it's easier to see, right? We might come in here and actually put in a second table, and we'll say this table has 2 rows, so we'll say tr Eric second cell, and we'll add another row just so it's fun. Favorite color, we'll say my favorite color is blue, and I like oranges, right? Oh, we have to add a border here too. Border. So now you can see I've got my first cell has just the word Eric, and you can kind of see that one of the things that's kind of neat about tables is it's trying to keep all the content displayed kind of centered, so it's doing like a vertical line by default. And then you can see the second table has 4 boxes in there, right? So there's a lot of complexity you can bring into your products going forward that you might want to be able to use tables with. Oftentimes, you'll have lists of users, for example. You might have to have 2 or 3 buttons in the final column over here to like edit, a pencil icon that lets you edit a user, a trash can icon to delete a user. You might want to put that in a second table so that those icons stay properly spaced and split out. Go ahead, Andrew.
So as things get a little more in depth later on, would we be maybe creating like an empty table and then using the back end to import data into each cell through an empty table that we just created the empty structure of?
Yes.
Okay.
Depending on your programming language, right? So we're going to be learning a lot of JavaScript here. Generally, what I primarily work in programming languages that are creating the HTML as their output. A lot of the stuff we're doing with JavaScript is going to have the JavaScript directly create the HTML inside the browser. So if I was doing this in PHP, for example, PHP is a language that is embedded directly into the HTML. So I would have like a table, right? And then what I would do is I would have a database somewhere, and when I run my PHP, it would be like 4 I equals 0, I is less than 10, I plus plus, right? And then for each time that thing loops, it would echo tr, td, name, right? Tr. Right. So this is a pretty common pattern where you're going to have your table is going to exist, and your code is going to loop through that table and create these rows and display the content that almost always is going to be pulling stuff from a database. In JavaScript, things are a little bit different. Some of the stuff we'll learn, especially getting a little bit deeper into the course, is going to be express-based, and so we're going to have some templates to play with. We're going to have various modules that will let us control the presentation layer a little cleanly. So it's hard to point to like one specific example and say, you're always going to do it this way, but you are always going to interact with tables specifically through your programming language on the back end. Some of the stuff that we'll start playing with next week on the JavaScript side, next week when we start learning JavaScript for the first time, we'll be doing it all in browsers. So you might have a table, and the way there's a couple different ways to add a new column in here. If we wanted to add a new row, if we wanted to add information, it won't be stored because we're not tying it to a database anywhere, but we'll be able to interact with it, and you'll be able to yesterday we were talking about it'd be fun to make like a to-do list or something like that. That's a really great example because we can have a list and we can say, I'm going to click this button and it's going to give me a text input. Let me type some stuff in, and then when I click the save button, it's going to add that as a list item. Okay, you'll do the exact same type of behavior with tables. Whether it's on the back end or in the front end, you're going to be interacting with this quite a bit. Okay, so nested tables, that's another thing you can do. Any questions with tables so far? We've covered kind of call span. Row span, I don't think I've ever used that, but I would imagine it uses, it's pretty much the same way. We could probably do row span here. Table nested. let's go look up row span and see what that does. Row span 2, interesting. Let's try an example. Okay, so yeah, this is showing you how to use it. We're saying row span 2, this table cell right here is making that 50 span over 2 rows. So the way that it does this here is that you have to exclude that third cell in here. So if we put in another, TD down here, I'm sure this would probably break. We can say test. Right? If we run it, yeah, it throws that extra row that we just added way off to the right, which is not the intended behavior. So if you wanted to use row span, you have to have room for that extra row to go. But in this specific context, what it does is it just like call span stretches across columns, row span is letting you stretch cells across rows. Cool. It's row span and call span. And the other thing we want to look at is scope. Yeah, I've never used that either. Alright. So those are tables. Tables in a nutshell. Anyone have any questions around tables? We're going to definitely play with these quite a bit more, especially as we start diving into JavaScript next week. But in general, you guys have made several tables, whether in Markdown early last week, or I think we're definitely going to be playing with it today in today's homework quite a bit. But I don't feel like you guys are struggling with the table stuff. But any questions, any other examples we want to look at before we move on? No. All right. IDs and classes. Now, this is super duper important, and we've kind of dabbled on this several times, just kind of explaining some things. Every element inside your HTML can have an ID and sometimes multiple classes. So let's talk about IDs first. Assuming we're here, right? The ID is an attribute that belongs to an element. So just like every other attribute, it starts with ID equals and then the element, the ID itself in quotes. So if I say main heading, right? This element has an ID that is main heading. Now, the important thing to note about IDs is that you're not supposed to share these across the product. So on any given page, there should only ever be one ID for an element. So right, if I went in here and copied this and I said this ID is also main heading, that's technically incorrect. And it also can cause things to break, especially as we move into JavaScript. Okay, a great example of this, if we go to here, I'm just going to show off a little bit of JavaScript here. So we're going to go to 3 dots up in the right, more tools and developer tools. Remember, we were showing this off yesterday as this is a JavaScript console. We can come in here and type stuff. One thing that we'll do pretty often is we'll use document.getElementById, right? So this is letting us reference an element on this page by the ID. And if I come in here and type main heading, right, because that's the ID we use, it's going to return this specific heading that we referenced by ID. This is one of the most efficient ways to reference an element in JavaScript in your browser, right? Because an ID is a super quick and fast way. It's like if I say, Andrew, how was your day? You know I'm talking to you, Andrew, and not to Leah or to Selena because I referenced you by your name. Okay? Is everyone tracking with that so far? So IDs are an attribute you're going to put on any number of elements you want, and really what we're going to use them for is getting them with JavaScript so that we can use them later on when we start learning about how to reference things. And then the second major use is in the CSS, right? So when we start learning about CSS selectors, which is really what we're going to dive into pretty deeply tomorrow, we can reference an individual element by its ID. And so the way you'd reference something in CSS by ID would be to use the hashtag or pound, like shift 3. So the pound sign, if you guys can see that, right? I could say main heading, and I want to say background color blue. Right? So now I've made this specific element have a background color blue. So you're going to use it in CSS, you're going to use it in JavaScript, and it's a way to reference an element, right? Any element on this inside of our body, including the body itself, right? a body can have an ID, and where you'll often use this is if you're building a dynamic app or a dynamic product. This might be, the name of the page that you're on. So this might be tables. Right? So now I can come in here and we can define styles that say when I'm on this page, body tables is going to get background color like a light gray. Right? So now I've made the entire page light gray. We could also reference it by itself. So we can just say just tables. Right? It's still operating on the same element. It's the same as if I went in here and I said document.getElementById tables. Right? It's going to return that body element to us. Now, that's why we would use IDs, is to just get access to a specific individual element. There's another type that every element can have, and that is a class. Now, what is cool about a class is that it defines a group or collection of elements, right? So I can come in here and say headings, and I can put this same class on all of our headings throughout our page, right? You can have multiple elements that share a similar class. Okay, so now I've got all of our H elements that we created, they all fall into the headings element. So just like with just like with the ID attribute, the main reasons you're going to want to do this is to access them, right? In JavaScript, you'll say document get elements by class name, right? And you notice that it says get elements instead of get element by ID. It's because it's going to return back an array of elements. So if I say headings, right, you're going to get a list of all 4 of our heading attributes that we've put in that class. The other cool thing is that it's also accessible in CSS. So with IDs, we use this hashtag or # as the way to reference an ID. The other thing to note is that when we're referencing classes, we're going to use a dot or a period, right? So it's like 2 keys to the right of your M key, right? The period. So we would say headings, and let's say we want to make background color green, right? So now all of our headings should be, if I save them, all an ugly color of green. Now, why do you guys think that this is blue, even though it's in that declaration and it says it's green, it's supposed to be green? Why is it blue instead of green? Does anyone have any ideas? This is something we're going to definitely talk about later this week, but I just want to introduce it to you while we're here.
Don't IDs kind of like override class?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, that's exactly right, but the reason it's right is about specificity. So the more specific you are in talking about something, the more... How do I describe it? Okay, so let's say there's 2 Andrews in the room, right? And I say, Andrew, do you know the answer to this? They'll say, which Andrew do you mean? And I can say, Andrew Buchholz. Is that how you pronounce your last name? Buchholz? Okay, cool. Then we know I'm talking about the specific Andrew. IDs and classes are the same thing at that level of specificity. However, CSS, when we start learning about the rules of putting together these selectors, the longer the string, the longer the string you put together, the more explicit it is in telling us that we want this. So I can come in here and say, h1 dot headings. Let's see. We're going to say tables, right? So it's an element that is inside the body element that is an h1 with the headings class. I want to make it green, and you noticed in the background it changed to green because we're now more explicit in who we're talking about than just referring to it by ID. So that's one of the cool things about CSS, and that's really what makes it cascading, right? We can set up all these rules from like, make my background light gray, all the way down to like use this font, and then we can, as we get into like individual elements on the page and we start talking about tables, it could be like the table looks like this by default, and then when I get to this tables page, I want my tables to look special, and I want my every other row to be like a light blue, right? All these rules can start to chain together. And we're going to really dive into that and explore that this week because you're going to use this programmatically, making your user interfaces in your websites later on, right? So without getting into all this, this is kind of just an early preview of like what we're going to be doing later this week. just as a simple way to introduce you to the concept of an ID and the concept of a class. These two attributes by themselves, like ID and class, you're going to use this on almost everything you touch, right? For the most part, when you're putting in table cells, we were talking about that example earlier about like looping through these tables. Almost always what you'll do as a programmer is you'll say, here, let's just make a simple loop for the sake of being silly. So here we are in, let's just do it in pseudocode, right? So for var I equals 0, I is less than 10, I plus plus. Right? So we're looping through, we want to, let's just say we're echoing, a table cell, right? So we've got a TR, and it's got a TD, and it's got name, right? And we'll just assume that was a variable of some kind, right? What you'll often do when you're working in this type of environment is you'll come in here and you'll say something like ID equals, row underscore I, that I variable, right? So that you'll have this programmatically generated list of table information that is linked to the step in the loop that it was from, right? It's stuff that like you're not displaying to the users, but if you need to be able to reference this, and a to-do list is a great example, you add a brand new element at the bottom of the list with your code. Maybe that's list element 10. How would we know which row to delete? And we would do that by giving it an ID that is specific to it, so that we could come through here through JavaScript and say, document.get element by ID. What do we call that main heading? And it'd be like remove. Yeah, I forget that. We can come in here and say inner text equals nothing, right? So now we've just deleted all the text that was in there. Or we can come in here and say, now it says 8SDF. So you're going to be able to reference this by the ID that you captured because you put it in there explicitly. You're going to do this over and over and over again. The other way that you're going to do this pretty frequently, classes are also interesting, right? So we learned about, let me take out this code so we don't have nasty nonsense from our examples floating around all over the place. Classes are also interesting as an attribute because you can put multiple in here. So we can say headings, and we can say subheading, right? So now we've got multiple classes in here. Only this top H1 that we created does not have the subheading class, but all the other ones do. So we can reference all of our headings by document, get elements by class name, headings, right? This is going to show all 4. But if I do subheadings, it's going to do 3 because that's how many H2s we have. Subheading. I didn't put an S. That's annoying. Subheading. Right. Oh, and I only put it on 1. Right. But you can have as many classes as you want, and oftentimes, especially when you're working with frameworks and some of the things like Bootstrap, it'll be like a giant list of of subclasses that you're going to use to mix and match CSS rules that you're going to create later this week. So I've seen things like flex1, right, and then they could be like p0, right. You can have all kinds of different classes in here that are all going to define how that thing, how this element looks. Like we could go into CSS right now and say we're going to make a class, right, because a class is a dot. We could say p0. And we'll say this means padding 0, right? So now anything that let's just to be ridiculous, we'll put padding 10 in here, so you can padding 100, so you can see what that looks like. So now we have giant amounts of padding around this element, right? So we'll define rules in our CSS, and we'll attach them to all of our elements that we want to style with classes. This is a super common pattern that you're going to do over and over and over again. Does anyone have any questions about this? We kind of covered IDs and classes. Just as a refresher to make sure we're all following along, what do you use an ID for?
You use IDs for like single things, like things you want to single out.
Yep, exactly right. And as I kind of hinted at this, an ID is one of your most efficient ways to reference an element. So when you're working in JavaScript, you can imagine this page has 5 megabytes of code in here. You might have thousands and thousands of elements. Getting an element by ID is almost always more efficient than searching through searching through an array of different classes and stuff. So it's just going to be faster, and we can play with that later on for sure. When we get into JavaScript, we can start learning about page performance. One of the things, especially as we start diving into JavaScript, the more interactive your page is. I'm sure you guys have seen before where your Chrome will crash, or you'll like pull up the task manager and be like, "Oh my gosh, Chrome is using here." Let me pull up mine real quick, and you can see Chrome is using up like a gig of memory, right? Why does it need all that stuff? It's because our web pages are really big. Writing efficient JavaScript and referencing the elements you want to play with, doing it by ID is very efficient, and it's highly recommended. Do I want code to open an external website? What? No, cancel. What is it doing? Let's take out this weird padding, right? All right, and classes. What is one cool thing about classes? Who wants to say a cool thing about classes? Maybe Estrella? What's cool about classes?
It can be used for multiple instead of just the one.
That's right. Classes are like it's many to many, right? We can have as many classes as we want, and it can reference as many elements as we want. We could put the same class on every element on our page if we wanted to. It just really it helps us like work with collections of items, right? Cool. IDs and classes. You're going to use them over and over and over again. IDs and classes themselves can go on each and every one of the elements we've explored so far. So you can put IDs and classes on unordered lists, the UL tag. You can put it on list items. You can put it on the body. You can put it on tables, inputs, and we're going to play with that in a little bit as well, right? Cool. All right. Anyone have any questions about anything we covered before we dive into? I think up next is forms. Yeah, we're going to start diving into the fun of forms. No questions? All right. So let's scroll down, get this out of the way. Let's make ourselves another top level section, and we're going to say this is forms. We learned a little bit about this before. We learned about it last week. By default, almost every form you're going to build is going to exist inside the form tag, right? So you might have multiple forms on a page, like it might be a login box at the top right of your interface. You might have a search box in the middle, and then you might actually have a form that is letting you collect user input. So each of those forms is separated by being held inside its own self-contained form element, right? All of the inputs that you want to do stuff with, whether it's a username and a password box, a search box, or a big list of inputs that we're trying to capture user info or making a to-do list, those are all going to be in their own separate individual forms like this. There are two really important attributes that we learned about for forms, and you're almost always going to include them. What are they? Who knows? Do you remember from last week?
There's action.
Yep, action's the first major one. We're really going to dive into this quite deeply when we start learning about programming, right? But the action just says, hey, everything that is in this form, I want to send it to this website. So just like with all of our other URLs, this can be a fully formed website, right? So google.com/search, right? Or what will most likely be the case is that you will be doing it to another file that exists inside of your project. So you'll be doing it to like as a relative path. So it'll be like search.html as the default thing. It kind of touches on the question from yesterday of like I've got really long URLs to my images. You can put any website address you want inside this action field, whether that's a full website that is really big and long or a very short website that is a specific file in your page, right? Like this could just as easily be index.html, and as soon as I click the submit button, it's going to redirect the user to the other page, right? So this can be either relative or full, okay? What is the other so we'll just put in here, URL to send data to. What is the other major attribute that you're going to use pretty often on forms?
Method.
Yeah, that's right. Method. And do you remember the two major methods we're going to use most of the time?
Get and post.
That's right. Get. Get is any type of thing where a get is basically telling the server, hey, give me data. Whenever you go to a website, if I go to tables.html, this is doing a get request, and it's saying, give me all your HTML content for tables. All right. Now, if we mark our form to say method get, we can still send data to that, but it's going to do it in the form of the request. So I'm sure you guys have probably seen stuff like this before, where you're going to have a question mark in your URL, and it's going to say something like user equals Eric, right? That would be a get request if we had this method set to get. Now, the more common thing that you'll do with forms is the other thing that Leah mentioned, which is post. And so a post is not going to put stuff in this question mark as a query parameter. It's going to send it silently as a part of the form data. So it'll happen behind the scenes. And we're going to dive into how to like really take a look at that later. There's a couple ways that it's really easy to, you could do this from like the network tab if you're inside your debugging console here. We'll also play with Postman, which is like a standalone program for sending and receiving requests to servers. That's advanced stuff. We'll hit that later when it comes up. But it's important to note that the two attributes we really care about is action and method. Now, there are a few others. One is like enc type, right? And this is telling your browser, the data I'm going to send along is this. And so the one you'll see most often is multi-part form data. Gosh, scrolled all the way to the end. You're going to use this most frequently if you're going to use a file input. So if your form has like upload your resume or upload a picture, right? You're going to want to use this enc type that says multi-part form data, and that just allows the browser to take this big file that we're sending and chunk it up into small little spaces so that it can be easily sent as a request. If you don't include this, it can cause, if you're doing like a file upload, it might not work. And you'll be like, why isn't this working? It's because you did not include this enc type. And enc type just stands for encoding, right? And if you scroll over, if you hover over this, if you got it selected, your Visual Studio Code is going to kind of tell you some of those options, right? Multi-part form data, text plain is pretty much the default. No, it says here, application x www form URL encoded is the default if nothing is specified. Text plain is another option you could put in here if you're just sending like a blog post or something, right? It's just about the encoding. It's kind of, you probably won't touch this very often. It's just important to know that when you're doing something crazy with forms that this exists so that you can go look up the right thing. Okay? But the main two is method and action. You're going to use those all the dang time. Everyone following along so far? Cool. All right. So then we move on to inputs. We learned about a couple different input types last week. We learned that there's the default type is like input type equals text, right? So this would be like, I'm just going to type in, this would be, you'd use this for like email address or username. You'd use it for a search input. Input type text is exactly what you kind of expect it to be, which is, it's just a simple single line kind of text entry field, right? There are a couple other interesting attributes that you need to be aware of. One of them is name, right? So this is a very important thing for the purposes of, here, let's change this to get, and we'll change this to tables.html. So the name attribute lets us tell this, the server what parameter we're actually, what the name of this variable we're going to send along is. So if I say name, first name, right? When I type and send this, you can see up here the query parameter, because we're using get, we can kind of see this visually. It's saying first name equals, and then that string of nonsense that I typed in, right? So name is super important. Name is very similar to ID. So if I came in here and said ID equals first name, right? You can have an ID that matches your name, because ID has to be unique inside the document. It does not have to be unique inside the element, right? We can use the same value here as name. I do this very, very often, and you'll probably see this as a pattern pretty frequently when you're working with form elements like this. Almost always you're going to want to include an ID anyway, so that you can reference it in JavaScript. But you still need to have a name attribute so that it tells the server what to do or what to call this data we're sending. Okay? Everyone tracking? The other thing, we kind of touched on this last week, is the placeholder attribute. And this is just what we're going to display as a default nice suggestion to the user. So I can say first name, right? And so when I load the page now, it'll have lightly grayed in this box. It'll say first name, but as soon as I start typing, that goes away. It's a placeholder, right? Exactly what it sounds like. Now, we didn't cover this last week, but there are a few other attributes in here that are pretty important, and we use these pretty often. So the first one would be, let me just give myself a little space. Size, right? This is going to be the width of this element basically in pixels, right? So if I say size equals 50, now you can see this box has stretched enormously. It actually might be characters, right? Let's look this up just so we're not telling you guys incorrect things. Let's look up input size. Yep, so this specifies the width in characters, right? So a lot of the size attributes that we've been looking at is width in pixels, but for inputs specifically, this is the number of letters that you'll be able to see on the page in general, right? So if let's make this size 10, right, as an easy example. So now it's really small, and if I type 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? It's not quite exactly 10 because we're using a variable width font here, so the 1 is much smaller than the 2. But if we change the size to if we change the style, font family sans serif or console, or let's do monospace. Right. So now we're going to make the font use characters that are all the same size. And now you can see we really just have enough room for 10 characters. In this case, it gives you a little tiny buffer, so it gives you 11. Okay, so that's the size element. Another important thing, we can put required. And what required will do is say it has to have a value, or we're not going to let this form submit. So right now it's blank, right? If I hit enter right now, it's going to pop up a nice little default message that says, please fill out this field, right? Required. Required is a Boolean attribute. That means you don't have to put in required equals required, which we used to have to do back in the day. This is still valid code. And if we come over here and we run this again, it's going to do the same thing. Oh, I can't see it because I got all this. The other one is autocomplete, right? So we can tell it what type of autocomplete information we want, and it's going to track that at like the phone or at the device level. So I can say autocomplete, birthday, right? And it's going to try, instead of pulling up this list of stuff, okay, save. Gosh, how do you make that box not pop? Oh, suggest. Let's look this up, right? This little suggestion box is really annoying, and we want to make it go away. So what would we search for to make this turn off HTML input suggestions? Right? Yeah, so we say autocomplete off. That was what we didn't do right. So if we mark this autocomplete off, when we're on this page, now it's not popping up that little box of nonsense, and we can quickly see that required equals required is the same as if we just put in required, right? There are some types of attributes that require an equal sign and then a value, and there are some types of attributes that are called Boolean, and what Boolean means is just on or off, that don't require that, right? And then we also learned the other attribute that this is pretty common, especially on like, credit card inputs, username, password fields, where you don't want it to display a bunch of information that might get your users in trouble. You might want to come in and turn off autocomplete. Okay. So, input type text, ID first. ID references an individual element. Name tells the browser what to tell the server the data is called. Size is the number of the number of spaces in characters roughly, and then placeholder gives us a nice little handy dandy thing that says this is the information we want to put in here. The last thing we want to cover before we take a quick break is last week we learned about a couple different ways to put labels in here, and so we learned, we would say, a good example would be strong and say first name, right? This is a common pattern, okay, where it looks like this. There's another element that is specific to forms and form inputs that you want to use pretty often, and that is the label field, or the label element. And what a label does is it's an element that you can put any kind of text you want inside of it. So we can still do strong first name, but if we put a label element here, it's going to tell screen readers and people that have disabilities and are using specialized devices, read this label to tell you what to put in this box. And the way that we associate this label to this box is by using the for equals attribute. And so when you do for equals, you're referencing the element by its ID. So you're going to come in here and say label for first name. Then we're going to add a little tabbing here so it looks nice and clean. We're saying label for first name is input autocomplete, or is this input first name, right? And so everything's going to look the same. It's still got first name here, strong, just like we styled it. Label doesn't have any style of its own. It acts like a span. It's inline. And so it's just going to have whatever we put inside of it. But when we tell it for equals first name, it's telling if I was blind or if I had a braille screen reader, those things can look for these types of elements and say, hey, there's an input here, and what the input is supposed to be is first name. So kind of like alt text for images, where it's telling us information that the reader downstream might need to know. Label is a really important one. When you guys start working in your commercial jobs, and you're working in life, these are the types of requirements that most of your clients are probably going to have. If you ever go work in government, for example, there's literally a law called Section 508, which means when you build a website for the government, it has to be compliant for people with disabilities, because it's covered under the American with Disabilities Act. So you're going to have to put in these elements all the time. It's going to be required by law if you're working for the government. It's also best practice if you're working on Facebook or some of these websites that expect to get billions of users, right? You want to be accessible to billions of users and not break for people that have disabilities, or maybe they're on a specialized device, or maybe their Tesla car, when they're driving down the road, will read the news to them. It's going to use this information that we provide in our structure of our document to do those cool things. Cool? All right. Forms, labels, inputs. We've kind of covered a couple of the different attributes that you're going to use on most of the inputs. We're going to take a break, digest what we've talked about so far, and when we come back, we're really going to dive into all the different types of inputs. That's the first major thing we're going to explore. There's like 20 or so different types of input rather than just text, and we briefly explored them last week, but we're going to dive in and look at each one individually, how you're going to use it, what the data is going to look like. It's going to be a lot of fun. Any questions? All right, it is 6 o'clock right now. See you back at 6:50. All right. So the color option here gives us a color selector, and this is really cool. If we submit this form with this behind the scenes, it's going to give us these values, right? So if I type in Eric and then I hit enter, you can see that colors equals B52C2C. If we copy this string, that is the same kind of color codes that we're going to use in CSS. So where we've been typing in CCC, and I can make this B5252, and that's that red we picked, right? So how this is really cool, and how you'll probably use this, in the times that you're using this, is that you'll really have JavaScript here that will change some element on the screen based on what you select as the color from this option. So let's just quickly show off how that works. OnChange equals body dot document dot get element by ID tables, right? So we're referencing that table element. We're saying attribute background color, and we're going to say this dot value, right? So in theory, if we did this correctly, if I change this value when it changes, did I save it? not. That didn't work. But in theory, what we can do is whenever this value changes to something, we can alert it. Right. So let's just play with this for a second. Alert this dot value. Right. So now let's give us that color. So on change, we can say. Let's look this up real quick. I don't do this type of thing very often, so we're just gonna have to experiment together. Change background color JavaScript. So there's a background color property, right? So we'll do come in here and we're gonna say document dot body dot style dot background color equals this dot value. Right? So now we're on this. This should work. Come in here and we change this value to something. You can see the page has updated behind the scenes to match this color. Right? We can pick any color we want. So this is really one of the more cool modern new HTML input elements that has been invented. Right? Back in the day, we would have to invent our own HTML color picker, and we'd have to have it be hidden. And when we would click on a box, it would pop it up and a whole bunch of stuff. But now this is native, right? You guys get this right out of the box. The important thing to note is that some browsers, like you'd want to look this up on W3 Schools. If you had to support an older browser, this might not work. Okay, but it is a cool tool that we can use to inject some joy and some fun as you're building products going forward. You can make it so that if you're building a website builder, for example, you might have every page wants to have a different color, and you'd want to just make a quick little color picker like this so that your users can say, hey, the background color of this page is a light blue or a purple. Okay, so that's a really cool one. Any questions about colors? I don't use it very often, but when I do, it usually ends up creating a lot of joy for the users that are asking for that as a feature. No? All right, the next type that we're going to look at is the email input type. Right? Let's give ourselves a little bit of spacing here so we get some extra love. So let's come in here and make another label. Label for equals email address. Right? This is another common one that you're going to do. We'll say email address label, and we say input type equals email. Okay, ID equals email address because we want to make it match, and we'll say name equals email address. Okay, but what is cool about email is that it's going to allow us to do some of that validation. So remember how we said required was one of our attributes that we might use pretty frequently to let us know, hey, you have to put something in here. It won't accept any blank options, right? Well, the email concept has what is known as validation. And so this is something that, I don't need you to be aware of all the types of rules and stuff in here. But what we can do is we can put in a pattern of what type of email address we want to accept. So if we wanted to make, if we had a company-specific email, right? So at the Clubhouse, right? We can come in here and say, this is only going to accept, an email address that is the Clubhouse, right? And this is some magic code that says it just has to have something at the Clubhouse, right? And anything we put in here that doesn't match that pattern is going to throw an error. So if I put in, Eric at harrison.co and I hit enter, is it validated? Did we put required in here? Yeah, required is there. It's not so. Oh, it's not letting me submit it, but it's not showing a thing pop up. So behind the scenes, it won't let me submit it until I put Eric at the Clubhouse, right? And now let's put in an input type submit so that we have more functionality. Input type equals submit. Right. So if you remember from the other day, input type submit is going to give us a submit button. Right. So now we know we need to fill out this field. Please fill out this field, and if I put in Eric at you can kind of let's turn off the autocomplete equals off. Right, that was the other one we learned. So Eric, right, that color. If I click submit now, it's going to say please fill out the field. But if I put in a fake email address, or if I just put in letters, it's going to tell you that this is not a valid email address. Right, this is not one of the ones that matches the pattern. If I come in here and I say at gmail.com, that's a valid email address, but it doesn't match the pattern. Right, so this is one of the cool tools that happens with the email type of content. It understands what an email address is supposed to look like, and we can start to, if we use this this pattern attribute, this lets us control more explicitly what emails we're going to allow in, right? If we don't have this by default, if we don't put a pattern in there, it's going to still validate this as an email address, but it's going to make sure that it has at least the basic components of an email, right? Is everyone following along with that? That's email. Okay, you'll use this pretty often in a login field. If you're asking for an email address, use this type of field so that you can guarantee that what comes in is an email address. Okay. And some of these attributes, like autocomplete off, required, you're going to use these pretty frequently to control the types of data that is being input. Right. If something is optional, you would not put in a required attribute. You would say, don't put it. If you got it, great. If not, no big deal. Another thing in terms of style, you can kind of see as we're playing with this together, because I have my font big so you guys can read it. Just like when we were talking about styles earlier, you'll sometimes have elements that have tons and tons of attributes. Stylistically, you might come through here and put all the attributes on separate lines, right? So that it's easy to read and work with, so that it doesn't scroll off the end of the page. This is something that you'll, as you mature as developers, stylistically, this is the kind of thing that you'll do pretty frequently, so that it's hard to work with elements like this when you're constantly scrolling. So be aware that just like with other things, when we're adding spacing and padding in between elements, we can also do that inside of tags themselves. So there's nothing stopping us from saying input and then putting a bunch of attributes below it. The browser itself is going to squish all this white space together, and it's going to interpret this as everything between this tag and the closing tag is all one element, regardless of how much white space is in here. We could put literally like 10 extra spaces in here. This is still perfectly valid and will still show up. So as you're working through inputs specifically, that's one of the first one that comes to mind that is going to often have lots and lots of attributes. You might come in here and say this is required. You might come in here and give it a pattern like we just did, and we say dot plus the clubhouse. Right? These can get unwieldy if it's all in one line. Thinking of this from the future developer state, where remember we talked about yesterday that we're writing code for other developers to read. This is not for the computer. The computer doesn't care. It's going to smush all the white space. But when we're writing things for each other, we want to make it so that it's really simple to tell this belongs to this, and here's the flow. Cool. What else do we want to look at? Let's see here. Range. Range is an interesting one. Let's look up what range does specifically, but basically it gives us a HTML. I don't want a range rover. HTML input. It gives you a slider, right? Essentially, it gives you one of those easy little draggy things like this, so you can provide this kind of user interface by default, right? So how do we use this? We'd say let's make some spacing here for ourselves. Add a label, and we'll say 4 equals range, and we'll come in here and say range option, right? Label. Input type equals range. So ID equals range, name equals range, right? So by default, if you go to our page, we're going to see this little slider here now. And if I move it to here and I click submit, put in stuff. I'm going to turn off all those required so we can move faster here. It's showing you that the range, the value we set was 18. Okay. What we really probably want to do, and let's pull this up so we make sure we're giving the right answers here. We want to set a min and a max and a value and a step, right? So these are some range-specific inputs or attributes that you're going to want to use pretty often. So let's, using our same logic as before, let's give ourselves a little bit of space, a little bit of breathing room in our code here. All right, so we got type range, ID range, good. All right, so min, this is going to define the minimum value that this can be. So let's just, in this case, say 10, and a max of 20, right? So now our range input is not going to have changed, but now if we're down here at the bottom, the minimum value, turn off this required, get out here, and get out of here, right? We turn off those required so it doesn't bother us. But if I come in here and I select this, it's setting range 11. If I go to the very bottom of this, it's going to say 10, right? So this lets us define a minimum and a maximum value that this range slider is going to operate on, right? This is, if you're working in the government, let's say you go get a job at SRS and you're building some kind of thing for the power station, right? You might have a minimum value of 110 and a maximum value of 220, right, for voltage. This is a really useful tool to let you quickly and easily play with these, right? And so by default, you can see when this page loads, it's going right in the middle. So that if we submitted this right now, it'll say 15. It's right in between 10 and 20, which we defined as our minimum value. If I come in here and I put a value attribute in here, so I'm setting it to something, I can set this to, let's say it's 19, right? We load this now, you can see that it loads further to the right than it was to the left, okay? This is a really useful tool, and you're going to use stuff like that. I mean, if you were building a media player, or you wanted to say, like, this is my volume control, this would be one way to do that. If I was building a grading system and I wanted to just quickly go between a grade of 0 and a grade of 100, like, this would be a nice way to do that. Any questions with range? Pretty self-explanatory? Cool. All right, the next one, time. Time is another fun one. It's exactly what you would expect. It gives you a nicely formatted input for capturing time, right? So we can say label for, let's call it the time, and we'll say time label, and we do input type equals time, right? And so by default, we forgot an ID. Let's put one in there so we're not forgetting. It's going to pop up exactly like this. But what's special about it is that it gives you this little circle over on the right, where when you click it, it gives you a really nice, easy way to just pick times that are valid time values, right? So it's going to give you everything from 1 o'clock to midnight. It gives you an AM PM selector. This is a really we were talking yesterday about would we ever build stuff specific to a mobile phone? A lot of these inputs were built with mobile phones in mind, right? So when we click this thing, this is not the most useful interface for a computer, though it is really nice. But what this is great on is if you loaded this page with your phone, this is going to be a really great interface for pressing with your big old fat thumbs, right? A lot of this was designed with mobile use in mind as the first priority. These inputs you can still type in here, so I can still say 7:45 p.m., right? But each of these little mini fields in here, I'm pressing up and down arrow right now, and it's switching between AM and PM. I can also type in AM, I can also type in PM. So it's still useful and friendly for people that are on computers or that are on a keyboard. You can, if you're a super fast typer, which all of you will be very soon as you get more typing exposure, you're still able to kind of navigate through each of these elements with the tab key, right? But you're able to, if you're building this so that it also had to work on a phone, these types of interfaces are great for that. Okay? Any other questions? No? Time. And if let's just make sure that we know what this looks like when we submit it. So let's give it a name. We'll say name equals time. And so, so if I click 6:35 a.m., 9:35 rather, it's going to give you time equals 09 %3 %3a 35. Okay. If we picked a time that was in PM, what do you think was going to happen? Let's make this 5 p.m. What do you think this value that we're going to submit to the server is going to be? I know it's kind of hard to read, but basically it currently looks like this. Right? So it's doing 9:35 when we submitted it before with AM. This special character, %3a, we were talking about the enc type on the form earlier, right? This is what's telling it what this means. If you pick the enc type that is the default, which was X, www, form encoded or whatever, it's saying that this encoding changes a colon into %3a. Okay, but if we submit this now that we're at PM, you notice that it's actually sending kind of like 24-hour military time. So it's sending along 1700, 1735 in this case, or 1756. So it's important to note that when you're using these things on the back end, you're going to have to keep track of, it's not sending AM and PM, even though it's showing that, it's sending along 24-hour time, right? So it's always important to know what these elements are passing along behind the scenes. Just like when we picked a color in here and we submitted this, it's sending this %23 and then B6 2F 2F, right? That's the actual color code that we would use directly in CSS. And I think this %23 is probably, if I had to guess, this is the hashtag symbol, right? So that's probably that. Cool. All right. That's time. Good. What else? What do you think's next? Any guesses?
Date.
Date. Yes. And Selena is even further advanced. She's on to like step 3. Cool. Date. So just like with time, input type equals date. ID date. Name date. He's going to give us a beautiful little calendar option, right? So we got all these beautiful calendars. We can quickly select between years. We can say, give me June of 2024. It gives us a little today box. You guys have seen this all over the place. Back in the day, this was a pain in the butt. There were all kinds of JavaScript libraries that would say, give me a little pop-up date calendar widget like this. Now it's built in, and this is not only that, it's built in. It's mobile friendly, so it'll look slightly different on your Android versus your iOS, but it's going to look native to what you're used to. And so, if we pick a date here, let's say the 25th, when we submit it, you're going to get this international formatted date, which starts with year, month, day, and then you would combine it with hour, minute, second, right? That's like the correct ISO format of date. So it always goes from biggest to smallest in increments of time, on down to like nanoseconds, right? But the date widget by default, even though down here it's saying month, day, year, when it submits it, it's giving you day or year, month, day, and with dashes, not slashes, right? I think if we check this real quick, I'm pretty sure that if we look up the date thing, there are maybe some attributes that let you, So we could put in a minimum month and a maximum month. So if we were doing a credit card picker, right, might want to say like, we don't want to accept anything that is that has an expiration date that is prior to today. So we might go in and say the minimum date we're going to pick is 5/25/2021, right? So like if you were trying to enter a credit card today to buy a pizza from my website, we're going to reject that outright, right? We're not going to accept any old dates. If you're doing a fitness journal application log, Andrew, you might want to go in there and just have this default to today's date, because most of the time you're going to come in and say, every entry I put in is for today most of the time. And so we can do that with the value, just like we can. Each one of these input types that we've been discussing so far, they all have a value attribute which lets you set what it is. All right, so we get a min and a max and a value. Yep, go ahead, Andrew.
Is there a way to set it to where on each load it just loads the current date or current time
Good
rather
question.
than...
Let's see. Is that an option in here? Okay. It doesn't look like it's got an attribute for it, but what you can do, and this is what we'll learn definitely with JavaScript, is that you'd want to do onLoad equals, and you'll probably actually do this a different way, but this is just showing you, like when this element loads, we want to do this dot value equals new date, right? And I think this should work. Let's take out this so we make sure we're not breaking it somehow. So this is just kind of like an ugly, dirty way to do it. Nope, that didn't work. Onload. Is this even doing anything? Let's check and see if there is an onload thing. Hello. Right. Yeah, so onload is not a thing. So what we'll do is we'll say we have the ID, it's date. We'll call it date field so we know we're referencing it correctly. We'll change this to be here as well. What we would probably do in our JavaScript, if you load up our thing, we'll probably have an event when we learn about events in a couple of days. The event would be when the page is done loading. We want to go in and say document.getElementById date field, right? That's going to give us the reference to that individual field, and we'll say dot value equals new date, right? Now, the specified format does not conform to the required format. So we would come in here and say new date dot get year, right? Plus new date dot get month. Oh shoot. New date dot get year plus new date dot get month plus plus new date dot get day. Right? So this is just some simple JavaScript, and this is a really terrible and inefficient way to do this, but just for the purposes of you can imagine the page has loaded, and we say, give me today's date, which is this string, and what in the world? All right, whatever. I'm not going to fiddle with JavaScript dates right now, but we'll, for the purposes of this explanation, we're going to say get element by whatever, and we're going to say the value is today's date, and we'll say 2000 or 2021 05 25, right? So as long as we can generate that date string, which we'll learn how to when we start playing with the date object because it's stupid, we can set it to whatever we want when the page loads, right? And often, if you're working in a back-end programming language like something like PHP, I would come in here and I would have the ability in my programming language to say, PHP echo date, right? And so when the HTML is generated, everything in this string is already in there. So it would have just swapped out this code for whatever the current date is. I'll do that all the time in the languages and frameworks we're using. Since we're going to be exploring JavaScript, we're going to have to go about it a little bit in a couple different ways, and we'll explore it both from the browser side JavaScript, whether we're loading it as an event on the page load, or we'll be, Selena just shared a little code snippet. That is exactly how I would have done it in PHP. We're going to learn to do it from the browser side, and then when we get into the back end using Node.js and some of the Express server stuff, we'll explain it from creating the HTML as the output of your code, which would be that version we were just talking about just now. Excellent question. All right. Any questions about date and time? You'll often use these together, right? So being familiar with the fact that they exist is important. Another thing to note is that a lot of these elements, specifically date and time, for example, they work great on modern devices, and they're also really good at being backwards compatible with old devices. So if you've got a client that's using Internet Explorer 6 for whatever dumb reason, most of these elements will just turn into a regular old input. So they'll still be able to type in dates. If I came in here and said, 2021, 05, 25, right? If you're using an older browser, it becomes one of these types of inputs rather than the nice fancy one. So they are somewhat backwards compatible, and you can feel pretty safe using them. I think one of the exclusions, this if you had a color picker and you were relying on it, it would turn into an input, but nobody's going to know that they got to type in this, hexadecimal color code, right? Oh, there's also a color picker too. That's neat. I'm gonna pick colors on the page. That's cool. Eyedropper. Nice. Neat. What else? What else are we gonna look at? Search. I'm gonna be honest with you. I've never used search before. It's gonna act exactly like an input, right? So if we give ourselves some extra stuff here, and we say input type search label or equals search field search label input type equals search. Gave myself single quotes instead of double quotes. And we say ID equals search field. Right? It's going to look just like an input. Let's see if there's anything special about the search type. Right? So we're going to go to reference the documentation again. Search input types of search are text fields designed for the user to enter search queries into. They are functionally identical to inputs, text inputs, but styled differently. Right? So yeah, there's very little difference between a regular input and a search, except that we've told the browser, hey, this is about searching, so you can do some stuff through CSS or stylistically. You might want to put a little cutesy spyglass, like a magnifying glass icon inside your search field. There are some things stylistically you want to do, and from a semantics standpoint, we're telling user agents, like the browsers or screen readers that we've been talking about for accessibility, this is specifically going to do a search. Whereas a text, traditionally when I've built search engines over the past 10, 15, 20 years, I would always use an input type equals text. but search exists now, and so it's good to use the right thing for what you're trying to do. Okay, even though you saw by default when we have a search here, it's just a text. Okay. URL is going to be kind of similar, right? So let's just copy this so we can quickly get into it, right? And we'll change this to URL field, URL field. Right. This is also going to function kind of like search in that it's going to look just like a URL. Let's see if it has any validation like the email address does. Yeah. So we can put this same pattern type of thing, and we can say, hey, we're only going to want to require, we're only going to let people put in information that is for secure pages, right? So we could do pattern equals HTTPS : / and then we'll do like a dot plus, right? Oh, dot star, even better. And so what this is doing is saying, if someone puts in HTTP : / like just regular old Google, right? This would be an invalid because it doesn't match that pattern. We would want them to use HTTPS so that we're transferring our data over SSL. Was there any other interesting things that it gave us? Nope. Yeah. So again, this is just another interesting way of us telling the browser or the screen reader or whatever, hey, the value that we're looking for here is going to be a web address, right? This could just as easily, if we don't include a pattern in here, I mean, this can also be an IP address, right? We could put in 127.0.0.1, port 5. What are we on here? 5500. So this is the same URL that we're using as our little private server that we have here on our computer when we're doing development, right? So this could be this type of URL. Any questions about that one? Some of these are like super new and modern because the idea is that the modern devices, especially mobile phones, are going to do something slightly different with these. Another great example that Selena kind of hinted at is another pretty common one here would be label for equals phone field, right? We can say phone number / label. And I think we can probably demo this off pretty easily. How would we demo it? Input type equals phone. And is it actually phone or is it phone number?
TEL.
Oh, tel. That's right. Yep. Tel. And we can come in here and say ID equals phone field. Name, phone field. And great. So, yeah, it doesn't do anything by default, but this is the type of thing, and I'm sure you've seen this as inputs before when you go to your phone. If you're looking at a website on your phone, when you go into a phone field, rather than showing a full keyboard, it might just give you a number input, right? So these are the types of things that the browsers on the mobile devices are really good at knowing, hey, this input is just looking for numbers. This input is just looking for, if you're in the URL field, right? Your phone might start out by giving you an HTTP button or a www button, right? Instead of just giving you a generic keyboard. So those are pretty popular. What else would we like to look at? There's another type called date time. We should probably look at it up here, which, as you would expect, combines both of them. Right. So if we just make this change date time, date time, date and time, date time. That did nothing. What did that do nothing for? Date time. Oh, it's deprecated, right? So this used to be a thing, and now it has since changed. Okay. So don't worry about that one. That one is old and taken out of the specification. There you go. That has changed since the last time I ever used that field. Cool. And another one, we were talking about encoding types when we were up here talking about forms, right? Another one that you'll use pretty frequently. If we come down here, we say, let's give ourselves a little bit of space. BR. Say BR. Input type equals file, right? And this is going to do exactly what you would expect. It's going to give you a file input type where it says choose file and it says no file chosen. This is what we were talking about before. I could pick a file in here and say vim info, and it's going to say, hey, when I submit this form, we're going to also send along this file with it. Right? You're going to do this for image uploaders. You're going to do it for if you needed to upload a resume, or if you need to upload a schedule or PDF. You're going to use this input type equals file to do so. And then, like I mentioned earlier, if you're doing this input type equals file, you're going to want to make sure you go and look up what is the appropriate encoding type, because you're almost always going to have to include enc type multi-part form data, right? If we wanted to actually send this file along. Okay. Alright, so those are the major ones for the input types, right? We've covered everything from file, input type submit is another one, and then there's another option that is input type equals button. And what button will do is nothing. Button requires you to code in what the action is. So if input type submit, whatever whenever we get input type submit, it automatically knows I'm going to submit along all the information about this that is inside this form. But button, if we come in here and we say value equals cancel, right? By default, I can click this button all I want. It is up to us when we start coding in JavaScript to code in that action. Right, so sometimes it'll be like clear the form. That's a pretty common use of button. You'll say clear form, right? And then you would have some code that says on click, for each input, set value to nothing, right? And that's just some pseudocode here, so we can explain this, right? So the clear form is going to do nothing by default. I can click this as many times as I want, and it's doing absolutely nothing, right? Whereas if I click submit, it's submitting our form, and it's loading the page again. Clear form does nothing until we code it to do so. Okay. Those are the major inputs. Before we go into some of the other special types of form elements, does anyone want to go over any of these more in detail? I promise you, you will use all of these so many times over the course, and you also use these forever in your career, like almost every day. Most of the time, if you go get a job as a software developer, they're not paying you to make web pages. They're paying you to make products that accept input and do things with it. So the form is how you capture input from the users and then act on it, right? Whether that's a login page, taking credit cards like we were joking about, if you wanted to make a fitness tracker and you wanted to say today I ran 5 miles, right? The distance would be in there. You'd have a drop down that shows like the actual, it could be 5 steps, 5 miles, 5 kilometers, right? However you wanted to log it. You're going to use these types of inputs over and over and over again. Any questions? Anything we want to talk about further here with inputs specifically? No? All right. We talked about this one last week, but let's look at it. So other elements that can go in here, right? One of them that is weird because it's not an input is text area, right? Text area takes all of the same attributes that we've had before, right? So we can have an ID in here. We can say blog post, right? It needs a name so we know what variable we're sending to the server. So we can say blog post, right? And so now we're going to have by default a larger box of text that we can type in. Right? And it takes multiple lines. So when I hit enter now, I'm getting extra lines. But you notice by default, it's giving us this tiny little box. Now our browser, if you're using Chrome, it gives us this little slider so the user can control how big this box is. But if we wanted to do this in code, we have a couple other attributes that are specific to text area that are really important, right? So we have rows, and we can put in here, 50 rows, and we have calls, right? Rows and columns. And we say, 6. Right? So now when we load this page, we got a ton of rows, right? We've made this really tall, long, weird text area, and we have a tiny number of columns, right? So you can do lots and lots of things in here. Like this would maybe be great for, some kind of weird list. But really most of the time you want the calls to be bigger than the rows. So we'll say we want 6 rows and 50 calls. Right? And it's going to give you a slightly larger text area. Now, the user can still type in here lots and lots of stuff, and it's going to create a scroll bar. Right? So that's another useful feature. And then the other major advantage of a text area is that it can be multi-line. So I can hit enter a bunch of times. You know, I can write a big document in here, and it's going to submit all of this along. And you can see, if we look at our URL, right, like it's giving us a big long string of things that the user has typed in. That's text area. Any questions? Rows and calls, those are the text area specific things. Another thing to note is that with the inputs, remember we had the value attribute that would let us put in stuff like Eric, right? So that would be like a default value. With text areas, that we don't use a value. Because it is a closing tag, right? We have a closing tag in here. Text area assumes that anything I want to put in here, I'm going to put in between these two things. So I could come in here and say like, this is the start of my article. Right? If I save this, then this content will be loaded. You also notice that I've got all this extra white space in here. Text area is one of the few types of elements that by default is going to preserve white space. So the reason all that extra stuff is in there is because I have tabbed this in. Remember, we've been talking about HTML by default is going to squish everything together. Most of the time, that is 100% true, but there are a few elements that we'll use. Text area is the first one we've been exposed to that assumes that what has been put in there is stuff that the user has typed at some point. And so we want to keep exactly that formatting because remember, it's giving us the ability to have enter keys and stuff. And so anytime we're putting in content in between these text areas, it's really important that this may be the one of the few exceptions where you really don't want to include extra stuff. You want to have whatever the content is that is our default. We're going to smush it in there as tight as possible, right? Because otherwise, it will give us all that extra stuff. And you can see when we smushed it, it gave us just what we put in there. Okay, so we have default information in there, right? Let's take it back out. We're back to a blank text area. Does the placeholder attribute work, right? If I type it correctly, maybe. And we'll say article text. Right? And so yes, just like with our inputs where we're putting in first name up here, that we do have the option, if we want to just give the user a hint what is kind of going to go in here, we can say, as soon as you start typing, that placeholder disappears, right? So it's a really useful feature that you can use to just kind of nudge your users in the right direction and say, this is the information I'm looking for, right? If this was, if we were building a social media website and this was a profile page, right? This might be like about me or like a bio, right? We might be capturing, resume information. So I could be in here putting in like, I worked at Vesta Chronicle. Okay. That's the sort of thing you use text area for. Any questions about text area? This is one of the unique ones. It doesn't act like the rest of the inputs, and so it's important to know some of those differences. Yes, Selena?
Okay, for placeholder, I've come across sometimes you have a placeholder on the box and you type something in, and then once you've typed something in but then erased it and went to another box, it doesn't actually bring the placeholder back. Is there a way that reason why it's doing that?
Yeah, so the placeholder attribute is relatively new. So this, I can't tell you the exact specifics, but this didn't used to exist as a feature. Okay, and so what we used to do as software developers, because we wanted this to behave this way, is we'd use JavaScript to have text in a box. We'd have a value there, and when you clicked in the box, it would make the. I'll show you an example real quick. So we got a placeholder up here at the top. First name. Let's take out this placeholder, and so we'll say value equals first name, right? So now, when we load this page, the value is actually first name, right? But what we would do back in the old days is we would say on blur. What's on enter maybe? Yeah. On click. Let's do on click as an easy one. This dot value equals nothing. Right? So we would say when you click on this box for the first time, we're gonna change it to this. Right? So as soon as I click in here, it disappears. Right? That was how we used to do placeholders back in the day. But if I leave that box and I have nothing in there, the placeholder doesn't come back. So the correct way to do this using the old methods, we'd say on blur equals if this dot value equals nothing, right? This dot value equals first name, right? So this would be us as a software developer making it nice for our users so that we've created basically what was a placeholder before placeholder existed, okay? You don't have to do this anymore because we have the placeholder attribute. That's a really nice way to just give users a hint. But there were a whole bunch of libraries and frameworks that would implement placeholders like this using JavaScript, and it would do it in a way that maybe they didn't correctly capture that thing, right? Because we said, a great example is we said, if the value of this when I leave on blur means I've left that element, if there's nothing in there, put the value back. But sometimes you'd come in here and you'd say, I want to put in, you see I hit a space bar and I've added a space in here, but now I leave, it doesn't come back because there's actually an invisible space character in there, right? So that's one example. And then a bunch of others is, sometimes people are lazy. They want a placeholder, but they don't care enough to add the, if I leave, how do I put that placeholder back? So that would be one possible suggestion. But nowadays, almost everyone will you're just going to use the placeholder. Placeholder equals first name. Right? And this was built fairly recently, like the last 5 to 10 years. Right? This didn't exist back in the day. Good question. That was an interesting one. Oh, I still have value set.
It happened to me once, recently.
Yeah.
Typing in, and I forgot what I was supposed to type in, and then I was like, come back, and it didn't come back, and I had to reload the page just to figure out what I had to put in there. So.
Yeah, and you'll notice too, like when we built our own version of placeholder with JavaScript, as soon as I entered this box, the value disappeared. But with the placeholder that's built in, first name is still there even though I'm in here, and it doesn't disappear until I type something. And it's also smart enough, but if I still leave the box, it still has that hidden value in there, the space bar, and so the placeholder doesn't return until it goes back to nothing. So there's a bunch of like little edge cases that you probably need to think about as a developer. And one of those, when we get into like actually dealing with forms and stuff, is what do we do with users who have put in values that have an actual value, like a space, but it's not a value that we think is a valid value, right? And so, we might actually go through here and be like, every time a form value changes, we're going to check it to see if there's anything that is not white space. So a space counts as a white space if I hit tab in here, if I hit tab down here as an example, right? Oh, tab goes to the next field. If I pasted some tabs, right? So we got some tabs in here. I can copy these, right? These are a bunch of tabs. Right? I can paste this. Right, so now there's tabs in here. We're going to want to check to see, does the value in my input is it actually content or is it just gibberish? And so often what we'll do if we're really good at our job is we will check the values of the form before we even let the user submit it, so that we can catch some of these errors that are going to cause us problems in our product, right? The range is a great option of this, right? But if in the olden days, if I wanted to put a range, I would use an input that was a type text, and I would say, give me a number between 1 and 50, and if I put 51, right, that's an invalid value, and there's we need to catch it in two places. We need to catch it on the back end in case the user doesn't have JavaScript, so that we don't insert a value into our database that is too big, but we also want to catch it here on the front end so we can prevent the user from seeing an error when we can catch it up front. But when we use some of these special input types like range or date times, we're helping the user by only letting them pick options that are correct. Right? Good? Everybody happy? And we'll dive into all the input validation and all that kind of stuff later on when it really matters. But you're going to do that kind of thing pretty frequently when you're working with forms, especially when you're working with users. You will see, I promise you, over your career, some of the craziest stuff being put into your forms. You'll be like, what is your first name? And they'll paste a picture of a cat. And you'll be like, how did you even get a cat picture into this box? Like, what made you put that there, right? Users are always going to put in weird stuff. All right, so we learned about text area. That's one of the other special ones. What if we wanted to do a list of items from like a drop-down list? Does anyone remember what that one was called? Did we go over it last week? It is a special type of tag. List of fruit. Fruits. And the special type of tag is select. And what a select does is it has a list of options in here. So let's look at a select, and we'll say we need to say name equals list of fruit, and we need to say actually let's make the name fruit. And let's make the ID list of fruit. Right? And a select is a tag that has we're going to put elements inside of it, right? Because by default, if we load this right now, it's going to be an empty little drop-down arrow, right, with nothing in it. But as soon as we come in here and we put in the other type of element that goes in here, which is an option, we can say option value equals banana, banana, right? And we can say option value equals apple, apple. And each of these tags require an ending tag, right? So we have this select box that lets us pick a value, and if I submit this form right now, and we go to the end, you can see fruit equals apple, because we selected apple from the list. Now, there is another type of thing that you'll put in here sometimes, and that is an option group. And what this does, an option group has a list of options. So if we do opt group, value equals, how do we do this? Let's pull up opt group. Opt group. It lets you group these, so label, right? So opt group label equals favorites, right? Opt group, just like we were doing with tables, right? When we were having tables within tables, or tables within a T head, or tables within T body, right? It is letting us make more complicated lists / opt group. More complicated lists that display more information. So now you can see we've got this select group, and it's got a heading of favorites. But then we can make a second opt group in here, and we'll say need to buy. And we'll say what's up, mango, right? Need to buy more mango when we go to the grocery store. And so you can see it lets you kind of break up your select group pretty frequently. We were talking about like how we would use tables possibly to split off admins and regular users. Often I'll use a select list like this with opt groups, and I'll say I'm going to put my admins up at the top. I select those most often, and then regular users, they're going to be in a list in the bottom, and I'll be able to quickly distinguish which group I'm picking from by using this by splitting them up with these opt groups, right? And so an opt group, it has a label, and just like in any other attribute, it's going to have an equal sign, and then you put whatever you want there. You can see we can put multiple words, or like these are gross, right? We can put anything we want in here, and it's not selectable in this list, and it shows up kind of differently. It shows up by default as slightly bolder, right? It's a bold style, but it lets you pick those in subcategories, right? So this is the first major thing you're going to do with a select box, right? What else are we going to do with select boxes? What if we wanted to select multiples from this list? Let's just copy this so we have something to work with here. Multiple list of fruit. Multiple fruits. Right? Let's change this. Multiple. So the select element has another attribute that is multiple, and that is a Boolean, right? So if we put multiple in here, right, we could do it this way as well. We could do multiple equals multiple. But by default, it's Boolean, so we just need to put multiple, just like required, just like, what are the ones? I'm blanking on some of the other ones we talked about, but multiple is a thing here. But now what we get is the select list shows up a little differently. You can see that it's bigger now by default, which is weird. If you click with a single mouse, but like a left click, it's going to pick one. If you hold down Control, it's going to let you pick multiples. Okay. And you can, if you hold down Shift, right? So right now nothing is selected. If I hold down Shift, it's going to let me click between two, right? So if I clicked up at the very top of this list and then at the very bottom of the list, it's selecting everything in between. Normally, as you can see right now, it is not showing us all of the elements that are in this multi-select. So one of the things that we'll often do is we'll set like a height Not sure if this works. 20. Okay. So we'll say style height equals 100 px. All right, so we'll use CSS to style this so that we can see more of it at once. Let's make it even bigger, 200 px. All right, so we're saying we want to make this 200 pixels long. So now you can see this is how you're going to commonly see a multi-select. It's the same exact element as this, except this by default lets you pick just one. This lets you pick multiple. But you'll also notice that, like, if you're not computer savvy with this type of select box, you know, you might think, I've made a multi-select option here. My users should be able to select, you know, all the different states they've lived on. If they had 50 states in it, they should know they can go in here and click stuff. I will guarantee you that unless you are building tools for software developers, they're not going to know that they can hold down the control button and click multiple things. They're not going to know that I can click between and let's make this super duper apparent. All right, let's put in a bunch of these things. Right? They're not going to know that I can click here and here with shift and get six at a time. So when I've had to use these in the past, because it is a really efficient way to like build a thing, you'll often have to include in the label like control click selects multiple. Okay, just be aware that this is a really powerful HTML input for the select, but it comes with the caveat being that a lot of your users are going to be too dumb to use it by default. Okay. Another option for multiple selection, which we did talk about briefly before, is a different type of element altogether. It technically falls under the input category, and that would be input type checkbox. This is what you're going to see. Input type is checkbox, right? This is what you're going to see more frequently. So you can say like Apple more frequently than the previous version, and it will say name equals fruit. Right, because we can have 5 of these in a row, and your users are going to intuitively know. Let's put in some labels, right? We'll say apple. Down here we'll say banana. Okay, great. Down here we'll say mango and plum. So you can see we have 2 different ways to select multiple elements here, like the default select box option, or we've given them a list of things they can check. This checkbox version is far more intuitive. You really don't have to teach anybody this. Like toddlers pick up iPads and can figure out how to do checkboxes. They probably don't know how to press control and select from this list. Okay, so starting to be aware of what elements you should use and when and why is going to be really, really important. If you're writing a tool for developers, though, yeah, just give them a select box. Every developer with their salt is going to know that this is the way you do multiples, and this is just a really easy element to use for capturing multiples of a list. But you'll use this kind of drop-down select all the time. All right, so we learned about input type checkbox. Does anyone remember what the other type that is similar to this is? We talked about it, definitely we talked about it last week. Input type equals, what is the opposite of a checkbox? Instead of letting you pick multiples, it lets you pick just one.
Radio.
Radio, exactly right. And it's built exactly the same way. So we come in here and say apple name equals fruit, and then we'll say apple or banana. Input type equals radio, value equals banana, name equals fruit. And the reason that these are specifically checkboxes and radios, is because you're going to want to have multiple elements that share the same name. Because remember, the name is the attribute that we're using to tell the browser to say, hey, when I'm going to submit a value to the server, I want it to be stored inside of this name, right? So the name is fruit. So let's call this fruit radio, right? Let's make this fruit radio. So when we select this option from the list, right, only one of these can be selected at the same time. And if I submit this, if we go into our top thing, fruit radio says apple right now. If I select the other option, fruit radio will say banana. So it's only going to send one of those options. Whereas with the checkboxes, if I pick, well, I got them all apple, right? So if I do banana, plum. If I select just apple and mango, let's see what this does. It's going to send it as fruit, banana, fruit, apple, and fruit mango. Is that what I picked? Yeah, so it's going to send all of those together, whereas the radio is going to send either or. Right, so this is going to say either apple when we go to the fruit radio field, either this or that. Okay. The other thing that both of these have, input type checkbox and input type radio, is a checked attribute. This is another Boolean attribute. So if we wanted to have one of these by default turned on, we would use checked. And if we do checked, you can come down here and see that yes, plum is definitely turned on. The same thing exists for radio. We can come in here and say checked, and now we see that apple is pre-selected. They can still turn it on, or they can, in the case of radio, they can still switch between them. But when we load the page the first time, if you wanted to have some of these pre-checked, you can come in here and say checked, right? So oftentimes when you're building a form, if you're pulling data from the let's say I'm editing a user and there's a thing that says is the user active or is the user inactive, for anyone that's active, you can have that active radio turned on already, right? It's pretty easy, and that is something that is really specific to these two types of inputs: checkbox and radio. And this, it is a Boolean. Boolean just means 1 or 0, but yes or no. But you can also come in here and say checked equals checked. And then you can also come in here and say checked is not checked. And this should have it. Oh, it didn't. Okay, so that didn't work. So if it's got the thing that says checked, it is checked. Cool. Any questions about any of those? Now, there's another cool thing. You're going to do this really, really often. So let's come in here and let's make sure this is super clear. We're going to come in here and say, H3 secret fields. Right? So we can see on our page we've got a secret fields thing here. Right? There's another type of input that you're going to use really, really often, and it is called input type equals hidden. Okay? And what input type equals hidden does is exactly what you'd imagine. It's going to have it's basically behind the scenes the same as a text type of input. It's going to let us put a value in here. It's going to let us put a name and an ID. So we're going to say ID equals secret, name equals secret, value equals Eric is cool. Right? So I'm tooting my own little horn here. Right? I've got a little secret message here that is not displayed to the user. They can't change the value, but yet when I submit it, I'm going to have a secret message that goes along with it. You'll often use this, like in our example of if we were building a blog, right, and we wanted to, we're editing blog page number 43, right? You'll often include a hidden input that says the ID of the post is 43, so that when we submit this information, the user doesn't care about like behind the scenes how to access that file. But you, as the developer, you want to know what fields am I updating on what record in the database, and that would be how one of the ways you could pass that kind of information along. Now, it's super duper important that you're aware that even though this is input type hidden, and we kind of made a joke saying this is a secret message that Eric is cool, is that behind the scenes this is in the HTML, and so the user can see this, they can see the data. And they can do stuff with it, right? So even though it's right in here, you can't see it, and just like when we're scrolling over these elements in here, it highlights where it's at. Hidden does not do that, so it's still kind of hidden. But they can come in here and see this, and they can not only that, they can change this. So you're not going to want to use this for anything that is supposed to be security. So we were talking earlier about like if you were making a blog thing and you said I'm going to update blog post number 43, and this said 43 to begin with. A user might not have permissions to touch blog post number 45, but if they come in here and they change this to 45 and your system does not prevent that on the back end, well, now they've just broken through your super great security, and they've edited a field they shouldn't be able to edit to, right? So I can come in here and say Andrew is really cool, right? And so now the message that I was counting on that would exist up here, it actually submitted Andrew is super cool, and now that change has theoretically happened because the user can still touch that. Another thing that they can do, if they want to make this really easy on themselves, they can come in here and see where it says type hidden. They can change this to text, and now I can edit this all I want. Right? So hidden is really great for you to pass stuff to the server that you need to know about, but is maybe not, it's not like mission critical or sensitive, because you are sending it to the user, and it is there. They are able to see it and edit it and touch it. It's just, you're run of the mill if you're building a product for, for people to use as a fitness tracker. They're not going to be going in here and fiddling with stuff. But if it's an important security feature, you don't want to rely on hidden as your method of, like, I wouldn't make a password and put it hidden, right? Because that is going to be completely insecure. Speaking of password, the other thing that we learned yesterday is the input type password. And that's exactly the same way as this, right? So when we're talking about security, if I say input type password and ID pass, right? Name was pass, right? People are all, you're going to see this on every page you ever go to, right? So one of the things that I'll frequently do is I'll use like Google Chrome to store my passwords because it's got a complicated long password, but then I'll need to log in on my phone. I don't remember what the password is I used. It's using this type of field, and let's say the password is like a really good password, right? And I've forgotten what that password is. You can see that the password field by default is going to replace the actual string in here with a bunch of dots, and if you were to copy this, right, it's actually copying nothing, right? So the browser is smart enough to protect us from letting us just copy this. But if I inspect it, and I come into this thing, and I type input type equals text, right, I can see what my password is. So I'll often, I'll go to Facebook or something and be like, I forgot my password. Because my browser has auto-filled it, I will just inspect that element and just change it to a text real quick. Then I can copy paste. Like a great example of how that would really happen in the real world. Let's take out the password. Right? It's important to note that just because we've typed in something secret here does not mean that someone nefarious can't come in behind the scenes and change that to a text. Okay, so just like with hidden, password is a nice like feature for you're going to want to use it for every password field, specifically because you're trying to prevent someone standing behind me at the library being able to read my password. But it is not a security prevention technique from letting someone get into the data of that field. Okay, and there's a bunch of ways to get there, right? We called this ID pass. We can do this in JavaScript. This is going to be pretty common with some of the the hackerish things that I know some of you are interested in. We can go document get element by ID, just the same stuff we did before. We called this pass, and we can do dot value, right? And that's going to tell us in plain text what is in that field. And so if I was able to embed some code on your webpage, I might have something that's running all the time that says anytime someone puts in a password, I want to take that password and ship it off somewhere else so that I can store a log of all the passwords that have ever been entered, right? You can do that kind of thing with JavaScript, and so it's really important to know what things are secure by default and what things are not. And in general, anything on a web page is, you're going to have to do special things to actually make it secure. Any questions about those? Let me see if we covered all of the major ones. All right, we were there. Call text area. Yep. Hidden inputs. Submit button. Yeah, great. Cool. So that pretty much is all you're going to do with forms for the most part, 99% of the time. There are some other attributes that you might want to know. Some of the crazy ones that we talked about today, like patterns. That's using regular expressions behind the scene, which is a completely another. It's like another language that describes how text matching happens. So we'll probably cover that a little bit later when we get into more of the JavaScript side of things. There are a whole bunch of other attributes like specifically around usability that are like a bunch of, it's called area controls. Let me see if I can find one real quick. Area attributes. Right. So area is the accessible rich internet application standard. So it's a bunch of attributes that tell screen readers specifically, like this element does this element does that. You'll use these sometimes for sure, but in general, you just have to be able to know, hey, I'm working on an input type text. what are the attributes that I may or may not need to use, and knowing where to look those up. I mean, the answer is almost always going to be Google or W3 Schools or some of these places we've already been using as references. They're going to tell you most of the things you need to know. Any questions? Anything you want to look at more before we take another break? No? All right, you guys are amazing. Easiest class ever. You guys are getting it. Cool. All right, it is 7:23, 7:24. Let's come back at 7:45. Should give everyone time to go get a snack and a drink and use the restroom if you need to. I'll be around, so if you have any questions or want to talk, I'll mostly be sitting here still looking at webcomics or something. So see you guys at 7:45. That you're going to just get exposure to over time. Some of these things will come up when we start talking about JavaScript next week and CSS later this week, when we learn about the link tag that we kind of played with a little bit yesterday. But for the most part, all of the basics that we covered right now is 95% of all the things you're ever going to do when we include these next two items. So what we're going to do is save our work right here. We're going to want to check this into GitHub. So we're going to use the plus button to stage our changes. We're going to say, let's save our tables page, right? Commit it, and then push. So now our code is correct. We're going to close these tabs. We're going to close this tab as well. And what we're going to do is create a brand new page, and this page is going to be called divs. Right? We're starting with a blank page. We're going to use our exclamation point tab trick, and we're going to change the title to divs and spans.
You're not sharing your screen.
I am not sharing my screen. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I promise I will continue to do that. Forget every day for the rest.
It's okay. I would too.
Every day for the rest of our lives. Cool. So everyone can see it now. I made a brand new page called divs.html. I checked in our previous code using the source control system. I'll do that again just really quickly because we just made this new page. Creates divs.html. Right. I'm going to save all and commit, and I'm going to push. So now our page exists. Okay. All right. So we've been talking about a whole bunch of different elements, right? We know about H1. We know about all of our heading things, so we can say this is fun with divs and spans. Right. So we've got ourselves a nice little title page. If we pull up our browser, we can see here divs.html. Right. Fun with divs and spans. Exactly what we expect so far. We've got a blank page with just one single heading. Okay, as we kind of talked about briefly last week when we explored this as a topic, is that there are different types of elements, whether that is inline or block, right? Does anyone remember the difference between inline and block elements?
A block is going to take up the entire space of its block, and then inline is going to stack up next to each other.
Yeah. That is exactly right. Inline is going to use the least amount of space possible, and a block is going to use the most amount of space possible. So the two major elements that we're going to use time and time again as we begin setting up the structure of our pages is divs and spans. So we were talking about semantic HTML before. Div and span, these are the two elements that kind of break these rules, and we just accept that this is these elements mean nothing on their own. They don't tell us anything about the content. They are simply a way to denote this is a division of tags. That's what div means. Like, this is a division of elements. We're going to put a bunch of things in here and then style them however we see fit. And a span is a smaller division of elements that we're also going to style as we see fit. By default, divs are block. So just like H1, just like if we put a P in here, and what was that cool trick we learned today where we say lorem 20, right? Let's do 200 so it gives us a good sized paragraph. Tab. And let's press Alt-Z so we get word wrap. Oh yeah, that takes up a ton of space. That's annoying. Okay. Another cool thing that you can do inside Visual Code, we haven't really touched on this, when we've got a whole bunch of stuff like this and we don't want to see it, and we don't want to take up a bunch of space, but if you hover over this little arrow that is right by the side of the numbers, you can collapse an element in on itself. So we can see that, between lines 12 and 14, there's another line that's hidden, and we can always toggle that open. But it just lets us quickly collapse a whole bunch of content we don't want to see, so that we can quickly focus on the things that we do care about. But if we go over here, we can see this P by default is a block level element. It's going to take up as much space as we want. It's going to be responsive, so it's going to grow and shrink as we build our page. Divs are going to behave exactly the same way, right? So we got this div in here, and if we put lorem, what do we want to say here, like 10, right? Is that a good enough example? Now let's do lorem. Let's do lorem 100. Right. So a div and a p are going to behave very similarly because those are both block level elements. They're going to take up as much room as we want. And for the sake of being able to like start showing some of this off, we're going to practice some of our other attributes that we learned today using classes and IDs. So let's just give ourselves a little style input up here in our head for meta purposes. We are going to play with a little bit of lightweight CSS today. So let's go in here and say, you know, for every P, I want to give it a background color of, let's say something real pleasant like FC9, right? Something like that. So it's like a light, ugly tan. For every div, let's say div, we want to give it a background color that's gray. Background color CCC. Right. So every div on the page is going to be CCC, and then let's go in here and make our spans have a different color. Span, background color. Let's give it a brighter color so they really pop out. So let's say yellow. Right. And our span has no content in it, so we can't see it. So let's say hello world. I'm a span. Right. And so we can see that, you know, right here this says hello world on a span. It's got no extra padding around. It's got no extra spacing or style by default. It's just got just the words that are inside here. And if we had a div that had this same content, so let's copy this block and come down here and change span to div, right? We can see that what a block level element is going to do is it's going to take up the entire width of the page. Okay, those are the basics. That's the difference between an inline style and a block. Okay, a lot of the inputs that we've been using today, all of those are inline elements. So when we got a text box, it's just going to be just the size of our text box. When we were working on text area, if we didn't put in rows and cols, it just said, you know, give me a text box that is just this big. But by default, everything is either a block or inline. And there are a few other types, right? So we can come in here and say, a div is actually, let's make one that has a class, and we'll say div.hidden, right? We're going to make a class called hidden, and we're going to display none, right? So any div that has a class of hidden will not show up on this page. And you can see this one just disappeared because one of the choices for display is block is the default for divs, right? And then inline, this is going to now behave like a span. So you can see it has now collapsed. And we can let's actually change this to div inline, and we're going to say background color green. Okay, and then let's make sure we change our class because we changed that to inline. And so now what we've done is we basically created a div that works like a span, right? We all following so far. So that's the difference between inline and block. Now, how you're going to use this in the real world is that we're going to section our content on all of our web pages going forward, generally using a combination of divs and spans. You're still going to want to use the correct semantic element like P, H1s, labels, to actually wrap and surround your content in a way that makes sense. If you're writing big paragraphs of text, you're always going to want to use paragraphs there, 99% of the time, because that is describing what is inside the content, right? If we pick a paragraph tag and we're saying this is a paragraph of information, this is important to use a P tag for. But what we will use divs for is for starting to split up our content so that we can start to position it around the page. And the way we would start doing that kind of thing, just as a great example, is we're going to leave all this content up here for now, but we'll say div, and we'll maybe give this a class of like main page, right? So we've now got a big div, and we won't be able to see it unless we put in some content. So we'll just say this will be our page. Right? So now we have a div here, and let's add some line breaks in here so we can keep our content. Let's add an HR. Right? We're going to add a horizontal rule so that we've got a line separating some of our example content up top from what we're going to be exploring for the next roughly hour. Okay? So we've got our div here. Now normally you won't have just content floating on its own, but what you will have is a bunch of other divs that are nested within it. So we'll probably have something like div, and we'll say class equals navigation, right? Div. And then inside your navigation, what kind of element do you think did we talk about using for navigation elements? We covered it briefly.
Scroll to.
Okay, that was for link. If we wanted to link to other sections, right? So we will probably use that in the thing. But what will we actually use to display our collection of links that we want to put in our navigation? Like we were making a menu bar.
List.
Great. So yeah, we would use a list. So we would come in here, and as we're defining this HTML document for the first time, if we can imagine that like all of this content wasn't here, and we were kind of working from a fresh page, right? So this is kind of what what we would really be working with in the real world, right? Let's just put all that back so we have it to play with. We would come here, we would say, this is our main page, and actually let's do that. Let's just take all this nonsense so we can kind of pretend like we're really working on this, right? We'll take out our HR because you guys grasp inline and block styles pretty well. So we've got an unordered list here. What is our element that we use for making list items? It's li. I started typing it while I was asking the question, so that defeats the purpose. So I would come in here and say like home, right? I would come in here and say something like, what are some of the other pages we made? We made a tables page, right? I would come in here and say we had a page 2, right? And then I would say we had a, let's just look at our list of files. What do we have? Oh, we have divs, index, and tables, right? So divs, right? So this is our navigation for this little website we've been working on just for today, right? So we've got this unordered list. You can see that this belongs inside this other thing, but because this is also a div, and we have a style up here that says, hey, let's take this stuff out. We said, hey, the background color of divs is going to be gray. What we would generally do is we'd come in here and say div.navigation, right, is background color. What's a nice pleasant blue? Let's say FFC. Oh, that's yellow. Let's do FFC. That's a good one. So we've got this navigation div that is in here, right? Now, where things start to get fun is that you would have, so this is our navigation element, right? We're also going to have at the same level, we'll have like div class equals content, right? And if I close that, so we have div class equals content, and this would be where we would put our, all of our paragraphs, and we'd say, fun with divs. And we'll have a paragraph in here that maybe says some lorem ipsum text. So we'll say lorem 50. Right? Great. You can see these are all stacked one atop the other. But where CSS comes into play is that these divs are things we can move around at our heart's content. And we're going to really dive into this deeply this week when we start looking at things like Flexbox. But a real simple way to that you'll see this really commonly when you're starting to work on this is that you'll come in here and you'll start defining styles like div.content, and we'll say div.navigation. So we'll say that this one has a width of 200 px, right, which is going to stop it from taking up all the space, right? And so you can say, so you can see now that this list over here is using a shorter amount of space than the full width it was using before. And then we would do the same thing with our div content, and we maybe say width is 700 px, right? And so now this one is smaller. Well, let's make it even smaller than that. Let's say 500, so it's easy to show. All right, so now we've got a navigation that is smaller and a main content that is a little bit bigger. But what you can do with these elements is float them around, and you can smush them up against each other. So right now, because one div is on top of the other, we can come in here with a CSS attribute, and we're really going to dive into this later. We can say float left, and that should, in theory, let's actually move this over here. Float left. And so now you can see we've got our content starting to be moved around the page using CSS, right? And so we can have navigation over here on the left and content over here on the right. And if we didn't have all this crazy colors in the way, then this would start to look like the structure of a page styled with CSS. Okay, that kind of thing is incredibly common, and so when we're talking about things like float left and float right, that is saying this element was was previously by default rigidly held in place based on where it is in the structure of this content. So if this, for example, this div was above this navigation, right? Normally, this would have then been on top of the navigation menu. But what we can do is we can say, float left on this as well. And now we just created a menu on the right and the content on the left, right? We can position elements around the page using CSS by containing them and constraining them within a couple of these types of elements. And div is the one that you're going to use probably the most often. You're going to start to put content together inside these structures and then position them and style them. And if you're design oriented, unlike me, you will start to work on, you will be able to make things aesthetically pleasing, right? There are really good websites that show off just the power and the flexibility. One that jumps to mind, CSS Zen Garden, I think is a really good example. What this website has done, and they've been around since like the dawn of the internet, like since 2004 or whatever. They have a very simple HTML page behind the scenes with all these types of divs and classes, and then what they let people do is, this is the HTML of the page, and then to show off what you can do with CSS, they let people upload CSS files and say, this design is called garments, and it's taking the exact same content that was in that HTML document and radically transformed it. So when we're talking about the difference between semantic HTML document structure versus the CSS that is handling our design, this, the sky is the limit with CSS. You can place things anywhere. You can make it look any different way you want. We'll start, as we dive more into CSS later this week, we'll start to learn about some of the crazy ways to like add background images and all kinds of things in CSS that that will really transform the way your websites look. But behind the scenes in all of this, as you can kind of see here, if I make this a little bit bigger, these are just a bunch of divs and H3s and Ps. All of the content that we learned over the last couple days, you're going to use this over and over and over again. And then we'll be using styling through CSS and interaction via JavaScript later in the course to really control how these pages look and behave. There's nothing magical about what any website on the planet is doing. You could literally, with enough time and energy, recreate all of Facebook with the skills that you're going to learn in this type of course, right? There's nothing special about what Mark Zuckerberg did in 2002 in his dorm room by himself to what you guys are going to be capable of doing, a little bit further into your journey as developers, right? There's nothing magical on the internet that you cannot recreate yourselves, and it's almost always going to be a combination of divs and spans and Ps and H3s and H2s. These are the fundamental building blocks. They're like the bricks or the lumber that you're going to use in construction, right? You're going to use the same functional materials in every single project that you work on. Okay? That's CSS Zen Garden, and there's a whole bunch of really cool designs in here that really just, if you spend a little bit of time in here, you can see each one of these pages. You'll see it's the same H1, it's the same content in the middle, the menu is the same, and all they've done is change a bunch of the styles, what the font looks like. There's thousands and thousands of options in here, all with the same content. Look, they've added animations. That's all with CSS. You can learn to animate content and make little cutesy little graphics that move and move around the page, all with CSS. Okay, so that is the basics of divs and spans. We've learned that a div is what we're going to contain our content with. We're going to be able to position those divs around the page. What you will generally see when you're actually in your software development journey and when you're working on real projects, which we'll start doing later in this course, is that you'll start to have large sections of content that are divs, and you'll start to bring those in with templates, right? So we built this kind of navigation here. What is missing from our navigation? These need to be links, right? That's another thing we learned this week. So we'll say ahref index.html. We'll turn this into a link. We'll come down here and do the same here. Ahref equals tables.html, right? /a. divs.html, right? /a. All right, so now these are clickable links that will take us to each of our pages that we built before. And all we've done, essentially, is contain them in a box, and the box is trying to make itself full width, and we've told it, hey, don't be full width, be smaller, have a background color, and be off to the right. Okay? But as you can see now, because these were blocks before, it's still doing some interesting responsive things that you would expect on resizing. With the possible exception, you notice that the text isn't moving anymore. It's because we've forced it to have a width. And so when we learn about responsive design a little bit later with the CSS things there are some CSS tricks that we can do that says, hey, if the window size goes smaller than this, start shrinking just like we were doing before. But you can still see that this div that was here that we're using for our menu navigation still behaved correctly in that it moved down to another line. A lot of the tools and techniques that we're going to learn this week specifically, is really around how elements are placed on the page, what they look like, and how they interact when you're on a mobile browser versus when you're on a full desktop with a big screen. Okay. What else? So we have built a top-level div inside of our body. We have built a main content div that has a whole bunch of content in it. Another thing that you'll do pretty often is that you'll come down here and you'll say, this is we'll make a div that is a class footer, right? And this one will be at the very bottom. And we might not put a complicated style in here. We'll just say div.footer, and we'll say something like background color, let's say CFF, right? So we'll make it like a light blue. And what you generally do down here is you'd have something like copyright 2021, right? P. And then another little HTML trick is that we've got the ability to say and copy, right? And then put a little exclamation point at the end, and that's going to give us the copyright symbol, right? So the one problem that you can see right here is that because we've floated these elements, so we said, hey, you were existing in this document, in this structure, right? When we put in these float commands up here in CSS, because we told it to not follow the order of the page, but to instead smush itself to the left or smush itself, we made them both smush to the left, is that this element, because it's not floated, it has moved up. So what we need to do in here is say clear both, right? So now what we've done is we've added a footer at the end of our content that is not letting itself run into the things that we floated to the left or the right. Now, we're going to go into way more depth on the CSS side of things, I think starting tomorrow even, where we're going to start to learn some of these positional elements, and we've already started playing with things like background color because those are easy. But in general, this is 90% of what you're going to do structurally to build web pages, right? If we wanted to add a third column, or we wanted to have a menu on the left, right? It would be as simple as coming in here. Let's just, for the sake of fun here, let's go left nav. I'm going to show off an example here of what you shouldn't do. So I'm going to copy this, say left nav, and we'll make this one, here, let's use the color picker so we can pick a color we like. A light blue, right? So now I've got a 3-column web page with a menu on the left, another menu on the right, and all of our main content in the middle. And all of this is going to smush and interact fairly nicely with each other, right? And our footer will always be at the bottom. We could do the exact same thing that we did with the footer if we wanted to make a header. Right? We'd come up here and we'd say, we're actually going to have a header. And normally what you'd see in a header like this is that, most websites, when you're building something like this, instead of having a copyright message, this would be where you'd have your main page title or your main H1. So whatever the page is about, that's generally what you'd put in this first element that is your header, right? And so now, let's go in here and say div.header, and we'll say background color. Let's pick a color. Let's make this like bright. Wait, come on, let me pick it. Make it bright yellow so it stands out. Right? We want this ugly website to pop. Right? So now we can see we got this bright yellow header. We've got a blue left menu, a light yellow right menu, a footer, and that's all with just divs, just by positioning these around the page. Okay? Is everyone kind of tracking along with how powerful divs are when we bring CSS into the mix? We can really start to position things around. Yeah, we can make boxes. There's all kinds of CSS tricks where you can make all these borders be lightly rounded, right? We can add gradients to these things so that there's really some cool colors. These are the fundamentals. Any questions before we move on to some, like I did something just now that I want to really point out because it's going to be really important for you to know going forward.
So you can have multiple divs that are just basically a section.
Yep.
And then you can style each one.
Yep,
yeah.
Completely independently.
Divs have always been just like this weird what is it for thing, because I always thought they were like paragraphs, but this makes sense.
Yeah, I like to think of divs as like the generic building blocks of websites, which is when in doubt, you're probably going to want to use a div at the very least around all of your content. Whenever you're building websites and you're building products, like when you start working on forms, almost always I'm going to start the form wrapped inside of a div. So at the very least, in the future, I can go in and say, this form is right here. I need to just move it to another location on the page, or I need to, I want to have the form that is inside this div to be styled differently than the default form that I use for my search box up top, right? I'm almost always, and this is kind of a code smell at times, but you will never go wrong wrapping anything you're writing on the page in a div, even if all you're doing is giving it an ID so that you can go into JavaScript and do something with it. So like ID, like let's call this.
So it's sort of like you have different file boxes, and then clothing, shoes, and notebooks, right? So it's just kind of throwing a whole bunch of stuff. Okay.
Yep. This is just a drawer of content that you want to do something with. Think of it as like a box. Like I might want to have the box in this room. I might move the box to this other room. It's got stuff in it. I don't care what's in it necessarily, but every box can hold something, and a div is a great way to do that, right? We could just as easily have used a P, right? This could be a paragraph, but what did we learn about semantics? We've said this is a paragraph, even though it's going to. Let's go up here and change. Right? We can. CSS will let us overwrite any style, so a P is still a block level element. So if I save this, I would have to also say P navigation. What did I do with it? Did it work? Yeah, so it kind of worked. All the pretty styles that we worked on went away because we were inheriting some stuff from div, but the P can still behave like a div. It's still a box, but this is not a paragraph. This is a menu, right? And so we want to use semantic tags like a paragraph. If a paragraph is a paragraph, we don't want to use a paragraph to be a menu. We want to use div is like our generic friend that we can use for anything. It is the monkey wrench in our toolbox that can fit around small bolts and around big bolts at the same time, right? Let me fix this. Okay, so we're back to where we were. Okay, now it's important to note, and I noticed that I did this as soon as I did it. I went in here and I said, hey, this div is left navigation because it's on the left side of the screen, right? But one thing that's really important in the context of designing applications that you're going to want to work on forever and ever is that it's important to use agnostic classes and IDs, right? This is not always going to be the case, but in general, I said this is left navigation. But what would happen if I went in here and I said, float right? Right? Now our left navigation menu is on the right side of the page because the class name we assigned it does not match what it actually does. So you notice that all the other ones that I did correctly, I just said navigation, I called it a header, I called it a footer. Like those describe the content that I'm putting in this box. And we could have just as easily, right, instead of because we're only having one header, I could have made this an ID, right? This would have been a really good use of an ID thing, because then I can come up here and say div pound hashtag header. It's still gonna everything is still styled correctly, but the header is the single element I'm gonna want to have that that name. Whereas class, remember, was for things that we did for both. Go ahead, Andrew.
So when you pulled up the CSS Zen Garden, there was an attribute within the div that said role. Is that just
Yeah, so this is one of those tags that we didn't spend any time talking about yet. These are some of the new HTML5 tags. Header specifically, section is one. There's another one that's, I believe, article or aside, where these are semantic tags that describe what is going to go in those boxes, right? So right now we're just really discussing using divs as a bunch of ways to use it as like a generic catch-all element, but there are actual elements that are like for navigation or articles or here's a great example. This is a footer tag, right? This would be a more appropriate use of instead of div class footer or div ID footer, because this is going to be, you're still able, if you come look at the actual this footer element, where is it at here? It's probably this. Yeah. So this footer element is this little list of links down here at the bottom. This behind the scenes is probably a block level element that they're able to style with CSS as if it was a div. But if you want to be maximally, like as you're building a product, like behind the scenes, this is really technically probably just treated like a div. And it's just a better tag that describes, hey, I'm going to put this at the bottom of the page, and it's going to have a list of links that you might want to check out, and it's important. But you can get there equally well by using div ID header or div class header or div ID footer. Like a lot of these things are interchangeable, and it was kind of like when we were talking about inputs. Like modern browsers give us the input type equals color, and we get a pretty color picker. But if you don't have a modern browser, it's going to default to a text box. So you can still type in the color code or a date or a time in those other examples. But the like for example, if I went in here and said header, right, that's an actual element that exists now. And if you type this in here and you hover over it, you can go straight to the web page that tells you how to use it and what it's about. Okay. We could come in here, right? So we have div header. I can just replace this now with header because header is a valid tag. Okay. I didn't want to complicate this HTML portion of the week by saying here is a list of 7,000 tags you can use at any given time, and here's when you'd want to use them. When in general, like you will probably most of the time start prototyping with divs when you're building something from scratch, and you'll say this is div ID header, this is div class footer. If you are aware those tags exist, you might just go straight to this and use the correct like semantic HTML tag that you want to use. But in general, a lot of this is super interchangeable. And if you go to your first job, they might not have been, some of these companies have been around 10 years before this tag even existed, and you might not see this in your code ever.
So they'll all function the same as long as you have an identifier like an ID. It really doesn't matter.
Yeah, and we're going to get into this probably tomorrow when we start talking about CSS. These are called selectors, and you can see this. Let's go down here. We were talking about selector specificity earlier when it's saying like this is an ID selector, this is a class selector, this is a tag selector. So as an example, this is a tag selector, and it's going to operate on every paragraph tag that exists in this platform, on this specific page. This is the one for divs, so all of the divs are going to have a background colored gray. This is going to happen on all the headers. But when we add in a dot, it's saying, okay, operate on every div that also has this class. Or, we took it out, but when we had this, it was div header, right? This was what it was before we changed this tag to header. This is a selector. And this is how you reference in CSS and when we move into JavaScript is saying like, give me that element and do something on it, right? CSS is really just concerned about the style, and JavaScript is really just concerned about like changing things. So yeah, but behind the scenes, right? As long as divs and headers and some of these other new elements like footer, it's really just an empty container that is a block level element that I can style. And if it has no default style, it's only going to get whatever styles we give it. So if we took all this out, for example, right? Let me go to our page, right? So that was yellow before. Now it's using the gray because it's inside this main div, right? And if I move this out, right, it will not have inherited that gray style that all the divs get, and you can see it goes to white. but it still behaves as a block level element. It's taking up the full width of the page, and then as we give it some styles up here in our CSS, that's when it starts to exhibit different behaviors and different appearances. Right, so a lot of these tags are going to be completely interchangeable, as long as, and even in the silly example we had earlier where we were talking about a span as an inline element, right? We can change the display type of span to be a block, and so even a span, you can, I would not urge you to do so, but you could make all of what you see here out of spans and just tell it up here that every span is going to be display type block. Right? So if we make every span a display, we could have made this whole page with spans. Now that's not the. If you were a developer and you went into work and you had a web page entirely filled with spans, you'd be like, "What were you drinking when you made this website?" Right? It just doesn't make sense from like a. You don't expect to see it. You expect spans to be small little squishy bits. You expect divs to be large blocks of content and elements that have moved around the page. And so making sure that when you're developing code, you're using the best practices to follow that code. A great example is like, I don't think of using a header ever because that was not a element that existed when I first started developing. So often, you guys are going to be at a greater advantage than me because you're going to learn the correct way to do things. I should have really focused more on like, hey, if you're going to put header content on the page, like a main title and you'd put a logo up there and maybe a search box, you should use the header tag. I just don't think to grab it because I can do this with a div, and that's how I've always done it, right? A lot of this stuff is muscle memory, and especially as you continue on your careers, new things come out all the time, and you're going to have to just kind of keep up with the changing economics of being a software developer. My current business, we've been working on it for 4 years. I don't think we have a header tag anywhere, right? We have a div class head. We have a div ID footer for sure, but we don't have these new tags. And you will be able to build really great websites and really great web applications doing things in a bunch of different ways. There's no right way or wrong way, and that's what's one of the challenges in a classroom context. As we start to teach you these things, if everybody in this group, when we work on homework tomorrow and it's telling you to build a page with a bunch of tables and all that kind of fun stuff, you could put in stuff in a header tag, and that's completely correct. I would have to, we'd have to give that 100%. You could do it all with divs, and that also is completely correct, and it's worth 100%. You could build this with spans, and I would have to, if it followed the directions of the requirements, and we didn't say use divs, we said just make a menu that sits off to the left. If you did it with spans, you're correct. I might look at you funny and be like, what made you want to do that? But there's a lot of gray area in what you can and cannot do as a web developer and as a software engineer, and this is one of those great examples. HTML specifically is just a way of describing a document, and the more precise you can be with the language you use, so I would encourage you to use these crazy tags like header and footer and aside. Aside, if you look up aside, let's do it in the browser way, right? Aside. Right, this is one of those other newfangled ones, right? And we'll see what an aside is for. We're going to hover over it and click on MDN reference. We're going to open this page, and it's going to tell us the HTML aside element represents a portion of the document whose content is only indirectly related to the document's main content, right? So if you're building a big website that was like a Wikipedia article, maybe over on the right you'd have an aside that was talking about like some record that person had, in the 1950s, right? You were talking about Babe Ruth or something. You'd be like, the aside of this is Babe Ruth actually started out as a pitcher. That would be a really great use of this element in a way that is semantically correct and describes what the document's structure, the content of the document is actually about, right? We'd still want to style this aside so that it looks pleasant, and we do that with CSS, but behind the scenes, I guarantee you, this is going to end up just being an empty blank element that acts just like a div. So we're still going to have to add a background, we're going to have to choose a font, we're going to have to place it where we want it to go, and we're going to do all of that with CSS. Excellent aside there. What else would we like to look at? So this is really the power of everything you're going to be doing from here on out, right? We're going to, when we dive into CSS and we start learning about some of the rules for styling this content, it's really going to be learning about how to make this page behave like you want it to behave, right? So even some of the things that we're doing here, this looks great on my browser, right? But what happens if I go to a mobile device? Things start to act a little funny, right? We start to see things that are overlapping the page. You know, if I'm on an iPhone and this is the size of my window, I'm not going to want to have a scroll bar over here to the left. I'm sure you guys have gone to websites on your phones before and you'd be like, this sucks. Like, that is lazy software development from a website perspective. We can do better, and all the tools exist in CSS to let us do that. And so we're going to learn that over the next couple of days, and we're really going to continue to practice that as we go forward, not just in this class, but beyond, right? A lot of the things that you can do to make a page look good on a lot of different viewports are things that, you know, your customer might not ask you to do, but if you do them anyway and you just follow the correct guidelines, it's going to save you a lot of headache and a lot of hassle later on when they come back and say, like, now make it work on a phone, right, or whatever. It will just already do it. So we're going to learn a lot of that stuff. But these are the basics, right? We're gonna have divs. We're gonna move them around, and then when we start learning JavaScript, we're gonna build on these fundamentals and make it so that, like, if I click on this home button, it's gonna load content inside here without taking me to a different page. Right? That's some of the cool stuff you can do with JavaScript. Any questions on anything we've covered? This is like the first exposure to HTML. We've really covered just about everything there is. You know, there's a whole bunch of tags. There's let's look this up. Total number of HTML tags, right? There are 142 and 132 tags, depending on which resource you look at. You can go and learn all 142 of those things, but I promise you, you'll probably only use like 60 of them or 40 of them, and we've talked about a lot of those today, right? Even the ones that we have, like input, right? That's one tag, one element type that has checkbox, radio, text, color, file, right? There's hidden. So there's a ton of complexity in HTML, and you're on a day-to-day basis really only going to scratch the surface of what that is. And then you just have to be aware of, how do I go and find more tags? How do I go and research, like, okay, I want to use a multi-select. How do I go and find how to use that correctly, right? And so just knowing where to go look is 90% of the battle almost all the time. Any questions? Anything you want to talk about or go over? This is really the crash course in here's a website. You will almost always, outside of this course, never really build websites on their own like this. Most of the time, you know, you're going to build you're going to use JavaScript or PHP or Python or any of these other programming languages to, like, build a website for you. A great example of that, like, we've got this navigation thing in here. Almost always in every language I'm in, I'm going to build this in a template off somewhere else, and I'm going to, you know, if I was in PHP, I would come in here and say include navigation.php, right? So on every page I build, I only have one file that has that navigation menu, and it's going to be slurped in everywhere. You're going to do that kind of pattern all over the place. And when we're talking about, like, looping through things and making tables, you know, you're very rarely going to make an entire website that just stands alone on its own, aside from, you know, in the experiments in our homework, and in if you're going to make a portfolio page or something like that. Most of what you'll do for your entire career is using little bits of HTML and combining that with the programming that we're going to learn later in this course. You guys are now all HTML experts. I believe in you. What would you like to talk about? Is there anything you'd like to go over? Tomorrow we're going to really start diving into CSS. Tonight's homework, which is what you guys will be working on tomorrow during lab, is really just a continuation of what you did today. So you're still going to be working in the same repository, the week 2 repository, and it's going to ask you to build some extra pages. That's going to be really important as we get into, like, CSS later this week, because we're going to style those elements and start moving them around the page, changing their colors, changing their position, that sort of thing. So all the stuff we did tonight together, making this kind of weird, really ugly website, you're going to do later this week when we start learning CSS. Any questions on the record? Otherwise, I can stop our recording and we can just chat for 30 minutes. Okay, I'm going to pause the recording.